Vanno cancellati dalla faccia della terra.
This was one of his earliest challenges, how to deal with the spectre of child abuse that had hung over the Catholic Church. His papacy became an opportunity to end decades of evasion and cover-ups. But traditionalists were fearful of his modernizing tendencies, affirming in their view, when he banned the Latin Mass, a form of liturgy popular with conservative Catholics.
Buon pranzo e arrivederci.
He went on to speak one then of Muslims as brothers, and was vocal in his support of migrants, even taking in some families to live in the Vatican itself. He also pitted himself against African Orthodox bishops on the issue of homosexuality, where Pope Francis went further than his predecessors. Although he never actually blessed the concept of gay marriage, he appeared to observe the rule of love above the rule of law. In a documentary for the Disney Plus channel, he also reflected that priests should be merciful towards women seeking an abortion. As the world was gripped by the COVID crisis, Francis publicly encouraged all Catholics to get vaccinated. He called this a small gesture of love in poverty, at a time when skepticism was sweeping parts of the globe, but the death toll was rising. Especially across his home continent of South America, he felt the need for practical as well as spiritual leadership. With the invasion of Ukraine, the Vatican needed to deliver its own message in the war of words between Russia and the West.
Questa bandiera viene dalla guerra, proprio da quella città martoriata, Bucha.
Pope Francis denounced the wake of death and destruction, describing the war as a crime against God and humanity. He warned of a rising nuclear threat, echoing the views of millions when he said the world once more feels fear and anguish.
Per favore, non dimentichiamo di pregare per la martoriata Ucraina.
But despite this continued spiritual strength, his physical being was weakening. Knee problems left him using a wheelchair for long periods. In the summer of 2021, he underwent abdominal surgery, and then bronchitis hospitalized him in the spring of 2023. It was acknowledgement of his increasing frailty. He felt a malaise, he said, but I wasn't afraid. And he continued with his duties in all humility. He had admitted drafting a letter of resignation in the event of illness, making it impossible for him to continue with his duties as Benedict had done. But then, in a more recent interview, he reflected he had no real intention of taking that step. His ministry, he said, was his life.
It's 12 o'clock on Monday, the 21st of April. I'm Tom Harwood.
And I'm Sophie Reaper.
Well, throughout the afternoon, we will bring you continuing coverage on the death of Pope Francis, who passed away aged 88. The pontiff has experienced a string of health worries in recent years and spent 38 days in hospital in February and March this year. But only yesterday, he greeted crowds on Easter Sunday in St. Peter's Square.
Yes, throughout the show today, we'll bring you the latest reaction as tributes pour in from around the globe. We'll also have experts' analysis, as well as any developments as crowds continue to gather in their thousands outside the Vatican. Over the course of the next few weeks, around 130 cardinal electors will make their way ahead of the highly anticipated papal conclave. Now, of course, a lot of people, Tom, may not know much about the papal conclave, but of course that is the process, the due process involved in selecting Pope Francis's predecessor. What that will involve, of course, is a conclave. Would you like to explain a bit about what that involves?
Yeah, this is, of course, it's become famous in recent months, of course, because of the film Conclave. But it's an ancient practice whereby the cardinals, and it used to be every single cardinal around the world, and not so long ago it was limited to only cardinals under the age of 80,
yes, of course.
Delivering this this distinction between cardinal electors and cardinals. But there's the famous process where they gather in St. St. Peter's Basilica and really don't leave until they select a new pope.
No, they can't have any contact with the outside world, and the only way we know what's happening inside is twice a day they will release some smoke. If it's black, that means they failed in selecting a new pope, and when that smoke becomes white, then we will know that a candidate has been selected, and then within an hour, I believe it is, they will then appear on the balcony and be appointed as the new pope.
But that, of course, isn't until we get into May, because there's a period where the funeral of Pope Francis must take place first, and then a 9-day period of mourning. We're expecting the conclave perhaps to begin between the 6th of May or perhaps the 11th of May. But there is much to look back on today. There's also much to look to in the future as well. I'm delighted to say that in the studio we're joined by the Church of England clergyman, the Reverend Marcus Walker, as well as the co-host of Catholic Unscripted, Catherine Bennett. Well, thank you to you both for being here in the studio for us. Catherine, we're going to start with you. Just some reflections on the life and the legacy of Pope Francis.
Well, I think the first thing is that there is an image of the Pope. The visuals of Pope Francis is he's a very humble man. He was very progressive. There's the I would say the outside world's perspective of the Pope. I think as a Catholic looking from the inside, it's slightly different, I think, and there's a bit more nuance required as we reflect on Pope Francis's legacy. But we can thank him for the 12 years that he has been in this post as our Holy Father, and look at some of the good, but acknowledge that there was ambiguity which was problematic.
Reverend Marcus, just to bring yourself in now, for any of our viewers watching at home, we are seeing live pictures from the Vatican now. Just give us a sense of exactly what will be happening there over the coming days. Of course, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands perhaps, Catholics around the world will want to make their way to the Vatican to pay their respects. What do you imagine will be happening there over the coming days?
So over the coming days, people will be gathering in Rome to mourn for the Pope, to pay their respects to him, to a man who's greatly loved, both within the Roman Catholic world and well beyond it. For 4 years, I was the Deputy Director of the Anglican Centre in Rome, which is the Anglican Church's sort of almost embassy to the Vatican. And in that role, I saw the huge love that, for example, Anglicans had for him, and the great relationship that he had with us and with Christians and non-Christians around the world. So there's going to be a huge descent into Rome of people there to grieve for him and to pray for him. And then there will be the papal funeral, and we don't quite know what that's going to look like. I believe quite recently he changed what a papal funeral would look like, and it'll probably reflect his style, which is much less grand than many of his predecessors. And then, having had that funeral, the eyes will then turn to the future and to what the next Pope will be like, and it will move probably from seeing the grief mourning a dead Pope to all of the slightly more political machinations of electing a new Pope.
Yeah, well, Catherine, of course, this will be a moment not just for Catholics around the world, but as Marcus said, there will be lots of people who have looked to the Pope over the last 12 years of his papacy as not just a religious figure, but to some extent as a social figure as well. And that's sometimes been a tension within the Catholic Church over the last 12 years.
Yeah. I think we have to remember that social justice must be rooted in the social doctrine of the Church. And what I think Pope Francis has been a very important figure, but quite controversial, and as you say, quite political. We must remember the Church is not a political institution. However, we pray the Our Father every single day, and in it we say, God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So it's impossible to completely uncouple the cares of the world. Pope Francis did his best to try and comment on political affairs, but as I said, that was quite controversial, and he's, in a sense, there's an argument that a lot of people were left displeased because some people felt, well, he's quite conservative because he is ultimately the Pope and doctrine cannot be changed. The Pope guards the deposit of faith rather than edits it, and so that won't be changed. And I think some progressives were very keen to see that change and are therefore left frustrated. and others feel that he was quite ambiguous in his pastoral approach, and therefore they feel frustrated that the doctrine wasn't more clearly stated.
Of course, today we should be looking a lot about who Pope Francis was as a pope, but I am interested in what happens next as well. I hope you'll forgive me for asking, do you think sometimes in these institutions we see a sort of pendulum effect to a more liberal figure, a more conservative figure, a more liberal figure again? Just with your sense of where the Catholic Church is right now, do you think that the conclave of cardinals would be looking for a continuation of what Pope Francis has been, or perhaps a reaction against it?
I think we have a complete crisis of leadership anyway. Generally, in the world, we have a crisis of leadership, and I think whether we love the Pope and his approach or not, I think it's clear that there was ambiguity, and I think that people are looking for clarity. I think we don't know. Of course, there's an element, as you said, that this is done in secrecy, and we don't know, and the Holy Spirit is involved, although it's not as simple as the Holy Spirit chooses the Pope. These are men involved in the choosing. But I would say that there would be a need, and there's a hunger for greater clarity following Pope Francis' death among the Catholic world, I would say.
Now, of course, as Tom rightly said as well, we need to today reflect on the life of Pope Francis. And interestingly, you mentioned a few moments ago that he was quite a unique pope, wasn't he? And he'd made changes in terms of the papal funeral and how that will go. I read earlier this morning that actually he is going to be buried in a simple wooden coffin lined with zinc, whereas previously they would be buried in 3 nested coffins made of cypress, lead and oak. I think that's just one fact, perhaps, that shows how unique he was as a pope. How do you think he will be remembered? What kind of legacy do you think Pope Francis will leave?
I think he will be remembered as I think it's likely that he will be remembered as perhaps a hinge pope, a movement of the Catholic Church away from being quite Eurocentric, away from being quite Italian-centric, even though Pope Benedict was German. He'd spent an awful lot of time in Rome and in Italy and was very much a Vatican man. Pope Francis came, as he used to say, you reached out to the ends of the world and found me, and you could hardly get further away than Buenos Aires. He, in his appointment of cardinals, looked well beyond the normal bishoprics and archbishoprics that would be given a cardinal's hat, and quite often made cardinals from tiny little islands in the South Pacific, or unknown but huge towns that would never normally go anywhere near a cardinal's hat. So he'd changed the whole dynamic of what, for example, the leadership of the Catholic Church would look like.
And sorry, for those that aren't so au fait with the way that this is sort of done, the Pope has absolute discretion to appoint cardinals anywhere that he wants, and just traditionally it's been more Eurocentric because that's where the Church was born.
Yes, traditionally it's been not just Eurocentric but Italiacentric. Huge number of cardinals from Italy, and generally when they get round to voting they would tend to try to back an Italian cardinal to become the new Pope. But the Pope has absolute discretion to appoint almost anybody, certainly any male, to be a cardinal. Historically, you did have non-bishops and as cardinals. You had lay cardinals. That's fallen out of fashion recently. They're almost all bishops. But although there was you had certain bishops who would normally be a cardinal, like in England, normally the Archbishop of Westminster is made a cardinal. He doesn't have to be, and it's very much the Pope's choice. And he very much looked for unusual characters, and quite often bishops who are seen to be much more sympathetic to his more liberal approach to the Church.
That is interesting, because this, of course, informs, frankly, what happens next. We think that it's around 130, perhaps 135 of the group of cardinals that meet the age requirements to be able to vote in the papal conclave. But given that there has been 12 years of this perhaps more novel approach to appointing cardinals, perhaps this is a very different sort of conclave to one that we might be seeing in decades past.
Yeah, possibly. I think it's true what you say there, Father Marcus, but the thing is, Pope Francis surprised people by elevating sometimes people who wouldn't necessarily be in line to be elevated. And there's been controversy around the names that he has elevated, Cardinal Cupich, Zanchetta, some people that faced quite significant controversy around scandals with financial and other scandals that Pope Francis elevated, and didn't accept the resignation of cardinals that were more in line with his way of thinking, but did accept the resignations of those more orthodox cardinals, perhaps. So there's definitely, as Father said, he has been a maverick in that sense, in those people that he's chosen to elevate. Now, what that will look like in terms of the next Pope, I don't know, because we're talking about a large college of cardinals, and a few figures won't necessarily make all the difference.
In terms of that process then, we touched on it at the start of the show, but just if you could elaborate perhaps a bit more about how that conclave process will now work when it begins.
Yes, so the conclave is expected to meet 15 days after, I think it's after the funeral, it might be after Pope's death, and it can be extended to 20 now in order to enable people to get there. They gather in the Sistine Chapel, which is where they vote, and they vote by writing the name of the person they want down. It isn't like there's a ballot sheet and they tick a box. So you could write anybody's name down, and
of all the cardinals,
or indeed anybody in the world, if they wanted to. I mean, it's unlikely that my name would appear on there, but they could, in theory. Normally the first ballot, people are throwing in all sorts of names to see where people might be, and then slowly that whittles down, and you see how many who's garnering support, and there are 2 votes in each day, and at the end of each ballot, those ballots are then burnt, and the burning either has sort of a little bit of black powder put in to send up black smoke, or a little bit of, I'm not sure it's white powder, but something to make white smoke. And to win, a candidate needs to get 2/3 of the votes of the cardinals present. And if they can't get to that, and there are points in history where somebody was just 1 vote off. There was almost a second English pope, the cousin of Henry VIII, Cardinal Poole, who just 1 vote off, and in the end his great enemy ended up winning as the compromise candidate. But it was, if you can't get that 2/3, you don't get through.
Gosh.
And they can go on for ages. So you had a conclave that lasted 3 years.
And they weren't able to leave.
They weren't able to leave, and the people in the town, I think it was Viterbo, anyway, somewhere near Rome, where they were meeting, the locals got so fed up with the fact that they hadn't picked a pope, they climbed up onto the roof and started throwing tiles down.
Wow.
Destroying the roof to throw tiles down to try and force the cardinals to make a choice.
I suppose this is the amazing thing about an institution like the Catholic Church. It has been around for such a long time that there are so many stories, so many intrigues, so many sometimes quite apocryphal stories, but also just so much history there to lean back upon.
Yeah, I don't like calling it an institution. I rather like C.S. Lewis's it's an organism. This is a living body. And there's also some great apocryphal tales of people who said, well, if the church can't put me off, then nothing can, because we have to acknowledge that this is a divine, this is both human and divine, as we see it as Catholics. So there are, in its humanness, it will fail and has failed and can fail in the abuse scandals and other things that we see. But in her divine teaching, she can never fail, she can never err. So we have both and. We have the church, which is true in her teaching, beautiful and good, but humans who are human, Pope or not, Cardinal or not. These are human people who are sinful. And so we see the effects of that. And we have to uncouple that in order to not let that drag us down,
Now, we've been seeing on our screen some footage of Pope Francis during his papacy, indeed before his papacy as well. And it's worth noting that his papacy began in pretty peculiar circumstances. For a while, we did have, in effect, 2 popes. Father Marcus, could you just explain for those that can't quite remember in clarity, what on earth happened to lead to this very unusual, perhaps sooner than many people thought, appointment of a fresh pope?
So Pope Benedict XVI was really quite ill in 2013 and made the decision to retire, and was the first pope since, I think it was Celestine V, to retire. He was the only pope to retire before him, and it didn't end well. He got murdered by his successor quite sharply afterwards, but Pope Benedict XVI did not, and lived in the Vatican Gardens for many years afterwards. There was also a rather amusing moment when he retired, because he announced his resignation in Latin at a meeting of the cardinals, and if you look at the footage you can see which cardinals do not speak Latin because they're all just nodding away, and then you've got about 4 who suddenly pivot round and realise what he'd actually said.
Wow.
But so that his resignation, which was a complete shock, led to the cardinals the College of Cardinals being convened after his resignation, and then the quite surprise election of Jorge Bergoglio, because people had tended to presume that with the fairly conservative papacies of Benedict XVI and John Paul II, that they had appointed cardinals who would be quite conservative and therefore were unlikely to go for quite a liberal colleague from Latin America. But that's what they did.
And he was a pope of many firsts. The first from Latin America, the first from the Southern Hemisphere, the first Jesuit to become pope as well. Catherine, can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, he's a first, all right. And I think there's been quite a bit of emphasis here on the simplicity. You know, people were struck by this simplicity. Pope Francis came in and wore simple robes and went to the Santa Marta apartments and not the papal palace. But again, I began by saying there is a way of looking the visuals from the outside and then looking inside. Of course, in a sense, that doubled the cost. It didn't reduce the cost because the papal apartment still had to be kept. We also had Pope Benedict was criticised for Pope Benedict XVI, for example, wearing the red shoes of the martyrs and some of the clothing that isn't understood especially well, and perhaps that's a failing of the Church and needs to help people to understand that it points to the transcendent. So in a sense, that was pointing to Christ, who is head of the Church, not the man. And one could argue that the simplicity with which Pope Francis, which he adopted, this simple robes and the simple palace, may not be quite exactly what it appeared to be, and it actually put a heavy emphasis on the man. So everyone's talking about Pope Francis the man, Jorge Bergoglio, when in fact the Pope should always point upwards to Christ. So I would just say there's room to look at those things, not necessarily as simple as, isn't he a simple, humble man who's always did the right thing? Because, of course, it's said in juxtaposition with Pope Benedict XVI, a wonderful pope who really was eviscerated in the media, sadly. But when he came to the UK, it was surprising. So many people recognised that he was far from God's Rottweiler, but a German Shepherd, you know, a gentle, very strong man.
Catherine, can I just ask you, you referred to Pope Francis there as Jorge Bergoglio. For many of our viewers, they may perhaps not know that is the actual name of Pope Francis. Can you just explain a bit about how a pope chooses his papal name and why that is the tradition?
Yeah, so he will take a papal name, not unlike the King and the Queen. I know King Charles took his own name, but it isn't always the case when they take a regnal name. So Pope Francis had this affinity with St. Francis of Assisi, and so chose that as his papal name. But yes, he was Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio in Buenos Aires, and it's hard to know exactly why a pope might choose the name. Sometimes it's to align themselves with the pope gone by, maybe the first or the second and the third, and then there's certainly names that would be avoided because the alignment is not one that you would want to hold. But that's what he would have done. But yes, that's who the man was behind it, because of course this is something, again, I think is slightly misunderstood in the Catholic Church, which is we do not worship the Pope. The Pope is a figurehead, our Holy Father, who stands to guard the doctrine of faith and morals. And that's the role. But it's not that everything he says, I prefer Coca-Cola to Fanta, that's infallible. That must be the truth. Do you see what I mean? So there's a slight misunderstanding about the Pope's role.
And now, Father Marcus, people might recognise the name St Francis of Assisi, not because they've studied sort of theology, but because they remember the words Margaret Thatcher uttered when she first stepped foot on those steps to number 10, the prayer of St Francis of Assisi: where there is discord, may we bring harmony; where there is error, may we bring truth; where there is doubt, may we bring faith. All of these sort of evocative images. But St Francis of Assisi wasn't particularly Thatcherite, if I've read correctly.
No, no, I wouldn't say you bracket the two naturally together. St Francis was the son of a merchant in Assisi. He had a rather unsuccessful career as a soldier, got captured, ended up having a serious conversion to Christianity and a serious calling.
And this was around the 1100s?
13th century.
1200s.
I'd say. My memory might be a little out there. I don't think I was there at the time. Yes, he was, and he had a real calling to serve the poor, and he had this vision of needing to restore what he thought was a church, but it turned out to be the church, and went to the Pope and said, I've got this vision and I would really need to restore the Pope and restore the church and bring it back to serving the poor. And from Assisi, he established an order, the Franciscans, that went out and ministered on the highways and byways and to the poorest in society. And that really clearly resonated with Jorge Bergoglio, such that he decided to take that name for himself.
And St Francis lived an incredibly humble life without material possessions, and we've touched a little bit about how Pope Francis sort of tried to do a more stripped down version of the papacy, which I think, well, I mean, of course you're an Anglican. I suppose many people would ask, well, is this not a bit Protestant of him?
I think that there is a great tradition of humility across both churches, and great traditions of splendour and grandeur across both churches. I'm not sure that either has a particular has a particular hold on either of those concepts, but. He certainly did try to focus himself quite humbly, and publicly to do that. He would celebrate his birthday with the homeless in Rome. He did move into a sort of clergy. There's a, sort of like the clergy house with priests who live in Rome, and he just sort of moved into a room there, which was absolute hell for some of my friends in Rome, because they'd crawl down, on a Wednesday morning with a hangover, have breakfast, get themselves a cup of coffee, and then suddenly the Supreme Pontiff is sitting across the table from them. It was
have to suddenly smarten up.
And they suddenly had to smarten up, but actually he was perfectly happy sitting there and sharing a meal with other priests in that. In what's not quite a doss house, but shared accommodation, and that's that was a very new thing.
OK, well, Father Marcus Walker and indeed Catherine Bennett, do stay with us, but we are going to head across to our correspondent Cameron Walker, joining us live from Westminster Cathedral, because, Cameron, in every country around the world, people will, of course, be paying their respects.
Yeah, they certainly will be, Tom, and I think Westminster Cathedral has, in the last few hours, become a bit of a focal point for Catholics here in the United Kingdom to pay their respects. We have seen probably hundreds of people now enter the cathedral just for a moment of silent prayer. We've also seen the Holy See flag above Westminster Cathedral has been lowered to half-mast, reflecting flags across the country. We know the King has ordered Royal Residence Union flags to also fly at half-mast, and we perhaps expect Downing Street to do the same, because it is, of course, the King who takes his information from the government. But as I was saying, we have spoken to a number of Catholics who have come here to central London today to pay their respects, and this is what they told us.
It was not any pope, it's our pope, it was our pope, and well, I think it's the best for him, because he stopped feeling well, or he was very ill So I think it's the best for him.
And how do you think his legacy will be remembered?
A pope that made lots of changes, and he was very brave, and well, he was a strong man with conviction.
It's certainly a very devastating news. He is the Holy Father, he is the head of the Church Universal, and I think all Catholic faithful in the world must be devastated hearing this news today. I think it might be too early to make a statement about his legacy now, but I'm quite confident his pontificate will be one of the most important pontificates in the modern history of the Church.
He was elected. I was also as a tourist here in London, and I came to this place when we saw that the smoke was white, and we all want to know who is the new Pope. So I'm very moved that today I hear that he's entered immortality.
Well, the Vatican announced that Pope Francis passed away at 7:35 local time inside the Vatican's Casa Santa Marta. He, of course, was the first Latin American Pope, but he was last seen less than 24 hours ago on Easter Sunday in St. Peter's Square, waving to crowds from the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, where he wished them a happy Easter. He wasn't quite well enough to deliver his own Easter blessing, and aide read that out on his behalf, but he was determined to be close to the crowds of worshippers, and he got into his Pope-mobile. He waved to the crowds around St. Peter's Square. He even stopped the Pope-mobile on a number of occasions so he could bless babies who were being handed up to him. But of course we knew that the Pope, as I said, was 88, had issues with his health, even from the age of 21, where he suffered from a pretty serious bout of pneumonia and had to have part of his lung removed. That, of course, was emphasised just a couple of months ago, where he spent more than a month in hospital in Rome for treatments for double pneumonia, but he was discharged and returned to the Vatican. The state visit to the Vatican of the King and Queen was postponed, but they did manage to have a very short 20-minute meeting inside the Vatican just a few weeks ago, only confirmed the morning of because, again, of the Pope's continued health. But tributes have been flying in around the world for Pope Francis. The King said he and the Queen were most deeply saddened to learn of the death of Pope Francis and were deeply moved to have been able to visit him earlier in the month. Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister's, also paid tribute, saying Pope Francis was a pope for the poor, the downtrodden and the forgotten, saying he hoped hope was at the heart of his papacy. The French President Emmanuel Macron as well, he has also paid tributes, calling the Pope a man of humility on the side of the most vulnerable and most fragile. And perhaps one of the last world leaders, or if not the last world leader, Pope Francis actually met was the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance. Now it's around 7 o'clock in Washington, D.C. At the moment, just after. So perhaps we will expect in the next few hours some tributes pouring in from the United States. But of course, we are expecting 15 days of mourning now for the Pope's funeral. And he has given us some indication before he died of the kind of funeral he wanted. He doesn't want to be buried in a grand coffin, for example. He wants it to be simple wood. We're also not expecting his body to be put on display for worshippers to pay tribute to, unlike previous popes. And then after that 15 days of mourning, conclave will begin inside the Sistine Chapel, where cardinals will travel to Rome from around the world. And if the cardinals are under 80 years old, they will vote for a new pope. But for now, of course, just a couple of hours after Pope Francis's death, it is a time to pay tribute to the first Latin American pope in history.
Karen, I just want to ask you, you mentioned about the King and Queen's visit to Rome just a couple of weeks ago. I know you yourself were there covering that for GBNews. Just give us a sense of what the atmosphere was like in the Vatican at that time, because, of course, Pope Francis is, and of course always has been, revered by Catholics all around the world.
Yeah, he certainly was, Sophie, and I think it was pretty much business as usual inside the Vatican where the King and Queen went to visit. As I said, it was only confirmed that morning, and it was a secret convoy that took the King and Queen from the UK ambassador's residence in the centre of Rome, from the outskirts of Rome, I should say, towards the Vatican City, and they went through a side entrance. It was all very hush-hush, and as I said, only confirmed that morning. And for the worshippers and those pilgrims and even tourists who were outside the Vatican as that meeting was taking place, they were none the wiser, and neither were we. It was only after that meeting that it was confirmed that the King and Queen did manage to spend 20 minutes or so with Pope Francis. The Pope wished the King well with his cancer recovery, and of course the King and Queen wished the Pope well with his own health battles. But I think from the photograph released by the Vatican on that day, he was visibly frail and he was in a wheelchair. And the pictures we saw of the Pope yesterday inside the Vatican with the crowds of well-wishers, he was in a wheelchair on the balcony. He only managed to say the words "Happy Easter," and the rest of his blessing, as I said, was read out by an aide. So perhaps, yes, it shows his determination to be seen in public, less than 24 hours before he died. But of course, it was clear that he was visibly frail at 88 years old and has continued to have lung problems over the last few months of his life. And perhaps quite poignant, really, that he held on until the end of Easter Sunday in order to pass on, perhaps filling out, completing his final act of duty before he passed away.
OK, well, thank you very much, Cameron Walker, live from outside Westminster Cathedral. Thanks indeed for joining us. Well, we're now joined in the studio by the Church of England clergyman, the Reverend Marcus Walker, as well as the co-host of Catholic Unscripted, Catherine Bennett. I should say that we are looking on our screens now at live pictures from Buenos Aires, where a ceremony is due to begin. Of course, Buenos Aires, the home city of Pope Francis, the first Pope from the Americas, the first Pope, indeed, from the Southern Hemisphere. Catherine Bennett, this is going to be a very meaningful day for the people of Argentina, for the people of South America. I mean, an incredibly religious society, and of course we're looking at this service that is due to start soon in what is a very early time in the morning for them.
Yes, it'll be a very significant day for the people there and all around the world, as you've said. But we have to remember that we are Christians, and Pope Francis died in the joy of Easter, and that I think we have become uncomfortable generally in the modern world speaking about death. We try to avoid it, and I'm sure Pope Francis, if he were alive, would echo that sentiment that we must look and prepare for death and not pretend it doesn't happen. So on the one hand, of course, we're sad because Pope Francis has died and we pray for him, but we also say this is where we're all called to be, that this is a reality that we have to look at. So it's going to be difficult for people all around the world, and they will continue to pray for him, but also give thanks for his service and take joy in the resurrection.
Reverend Marcus, just to bring yourself in, obviously this is an incredibly special and poignant time in the religious calendar for Catholics all over the world. Just how poignant is it perhaps then that Pope Francis has passed away in the day following Easter Sunday?
I think it's hugely poignant. I think it's really powerful. We have just marked in the last week the holiest season of the Christian year. On Friday, it was Good Friday, and we were there with Christ at the cross as he died. And on Holy Saturday, there's a sort of dreadful day where sort of Christ is dead, and where all of the churches are dark, and everything is, it looks like hope is gone. And then you get to Easter Day when Christ is risen, and actually not just he's risen, but he's brought the whole of us with him. And you've got this wonderful explosion of joy in the expectation that we will rise again. And Pope Francis has died right at that point where the sure and certain hope of the resurrection of the dead is at its peak. And I think that it is wonderful that he's been able to walk with Christ this last time and celebrate Easter one last time before he died.
There does seem to be something that perhaps keeps people going at moments like this. One last duty, one last Easter, one last grand event. I think we saw it with Her Majesty the Queen in appointing her final Prime Minister and declining very rapidly after that. I think perhaps what we saw over the course of the last week, had it not been Easter, had it been a different time of year, perhaps the Pope wouldn't have found the strength to go on for so long.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a ridiculously high statistical correlation of dying within 10 days of your birthday. People holding off just to that moment. And I think for the Supreme Pontiff and the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, holding off to Easter would be, I'd say, even bigger than his birthday. Yes. You can really see why he would want to celebrate Easter one last time.
Yes, my own mother died 6 years ago around this time as well, and there's a story there of her holding off and very, very near the end and held off until she saw her brothers. And I just want to make a point at this time when we're discussing this, that's why, as we talk about the assisted suicide bill, it's important to remember that we just don't know sometimes, and you've just spoken about how Pope Francis might have held on, and we cannot take those decisions into our own hands. And I think Pope Francis would have always spoken against that as head of the Catholic Church. So he's shown now in his final days that he's waited for that natural death.
OK, well, Catherine Bennett and Father Marcus Walker, thanks indeed for being with us for now. We will have you back in just a moment's time, but I should say we are looking at live pictures of the Vatican on our screens now, where, of course, Catholics from across Rome, no doubt from across Italy, will also be travelling to pay their respects to the late Pope, Pope Francis, the first to take that name, of course, and this a moment in the Catholic year, but also, I suppose, in time for all of us to think back on what the last 12 years have meant, not just for the Catholic Church, but also for such a weighty cultural figure across the whole world.
Absolutely, and of course, over the coming days and weeks in the Vatican, there will be plenty to come, although the papal funeral has usually been an elaborate affair. Of course, Pope Francis taking his name from St. Francis of Assisi. He approved plans to make the whole thing a little bit less complex. Instead of being buried in 3 nested coffins, he instead will have a simple wooden coffin lined with zinc. Usually, of course, as well, popes are placed on a raised platform. He instead, mourners will be invited to pay their respects to St. Francis in public viewing at inside the coffin with the lid removed. So a slightly different papal funeral to the one we perhaps have seen in the past, because this is a pope that is slightly different to those we've seen in the past, Tom.
Well, of course, tributes have been pouring in, not just from the religious world, not just from civil society, not just, as we can see on our screens, from people in Rome who've made their way to the Vatican. But also, of course, we've heard that tributes have been pouring in from politicians throughout the day. I'm delighted to say that joining us in our studio now is political correspondent Catherine Forster. Catherine, everyone's having their say.
Yes, exactly. This Easter Monday from around the world, but let's start at home with the Prime Minister. So an hour or two ago, a statement from Sir Keir Starmer. I'll just read you a couple of little snippets of it. He said, "I join millions around the world in grieving the death of His Holiness Pope Francis. His leadership in a complex and challenging time for the world and the Church was courageous, yet always came from a place of deep humility." Went on to say that Pope Francis was a pope for the poor, the downtrodden and the forgotten. Hearing from the leader of the opposition too, Kemi Badenoch, she said Pope Francis spent his final Easter yesterday bearing witness to the faith he devoted his life to, a quiet presence at a time when the world needed humility, courage and conviction. His death on Easter Monday feels especially poignant. He reminded us that leadership isn't about power, but about service. Also, Sir Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, He has said it's a profound loss to millions across the world and described Pope Francis as a leader of compassion and courage, speaking up for those in need and calling for peace in a world too often divided. Nigel Farage, leader of Reform, has said, "My sympathies go out to all in the Catholic Church following the death of Pope Francis. I met him and I liked him very much." Worth saying, too, that the American Vice President, J.D. Vance, was with Pope Francis only yesterday, briefly, admittedly, but with him. And he has said, "My heart goes out to the millions of Christians all over the world who loved him. I was happy to see him yesterday, though he was obviously very ill." J.D. Vance converted to Catholicism some 6 years ago. Then we've had European leaders. Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, has said, "The Pope's death makes me deeply sad. He was a great man and a great shepherd." French President Emmanuel Macron has said, "From Buenos Aires and Rome, Pope Francis wanted to bring joy and hope to the poorest. May it unite people with each other. May this hope continually revive beyond him." And then also we have heard from Vladimir Putin, who has offered my most sincere condolences. And he said that the Pope actively promoted the development of dialogue between the Russian Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches, as well as constructive cooperation between Russia and the Holy See. We have yet to hear from Donald Trump directly, but the White House a couple of hours ago did put out "Rest in peace, Pope Francis," along with, on the one hand, a picture of Donald Trump and Melania with a much younger Pope Francis, and then on the other side, a picture taken yesterday with J.D. Vance and the Pope.
I suppose we need to wait a little bit more for the Americans on the East Coast to wake up and see more full-throated statements from them. But of course, J.D. Vance, I believe, is still in Italy after his meeting in Rome yesterday, so that would account for that. Just while we have you, Catherine, this is, of course, one of those moments where people will ask you in sort of years to come, where were you when Pope Francis dies? It's one of those moments that we sort of have as a linchpin through moments in time. We saw this with great world events, we see this with deaths of great figures. So perhaps it is no doubt that so many political figures have weighed in and given their statements. I was surprised, actually, to see how many of them had met Pope Francis as the years went by.
Yes, indeed, and he touched people, and not just Catholics, around the world. And it is a moment that you only get, rarely. I think comparable, I suppose, to, our late Queen. Everybody remembers where they were, and the Pope met so many people through this very long and diverse life and the many different careers that he had before he became a Pope. And striking too, isn't it, how our late Queen was going still right up until the end. Most people retire from ordinary jobs in their 60s and have a relaxing later life. Both the late Queen and the Pope going right until the end, because we had the Queen meeting Liz Truss, didn't we? Just literally 2 days before she died. And then yesterday, the Vice President of the US meeting the Pope, and yet early this morning, he passed away.
Yeah, really struck me the sort of similarities between those photographs, sort of duty till the end, really to the very end.
Yeah, indeed, and we've known that he was frail for months and weeks, haven't we? And yesterday when J.D. Vance met him, he apparently said that, glad to see you in better health. And I think the fact that, OK, he was obviously frail, he was 88, he was in a wheelchair, he didn't speak much, but the fact that he was able to go onto that balcony and say those few words and then tour through on that Pope-mobile, quite incredible, service, as you say, till the very end.
Perhaps perhaps it was something that our previous guest, Reverend Marcus Walker, said about him holding out till Easter Sunday because it was such a special occasion. Catherine Foster, thank you so much for joining us in the studio. Quite the testimony in those statements, isn't there? Words of humility, serving the poor, devotion. Now, there's one statement that Catherine didn't read that I want to read that I think you'll appreciate, Tom.
Oh, yes.
From Sir Tony Blair, who said, "Sir Pope Francis was admired for his humility, compassion and unwavering commitment to the Christian faith." Of course, former Prime Minister converted to Catholicism, didn't he, following his time in office. He said he was an extraordinary and devoted servant of the Catholic Church, admired both within and beyond it for his humility, compassion and unwavering commitment to the service of all humanity, Christian and non-Christian alike. Sherry and I are deeply saddened by his passing. May he rest in peace. And again, such a testament to his 12 years as Pope, isn't it, that people are so keen to come forward, as you said, to give those statements of prayer and respect for his time as the Pope.
Yes, absolutely, and I think that it is one of those moments where we will hear so much more from so many more people throughout the course of the day. Particularly, we'll hear much more from the United States of America and from the Americas in general. I'm interested to hear from, for example, the president of Argentina, Javier Milei, who no doubt will be speaking to this as well. But shall we return to our panel now? Delighted to be joined in the studio by the Church of England clergyman, the Reverend Marcus Walker, as well as the co-host of Catholic Unscripted, Catherine Bennett. Now, Father Marcus, you were effectively in the Anglican embassy to the Vatican for 4 years, for want of a better term. We're looking at live pictures of the Vatican now. It's an area, of course, you know well. Could you tell us sort of what we're looking at and what's going on in these pictures?
So you're looking at St. Peter's Square. This is the huge square right in front of St. Peter's Basilica, which is the great church which contains the bones of the tomb of St. Peter, the relics of St. Peter himself, the rock upon which Christ built his church, the foundation, really, of the papal sort of claims of authority. That huge square outside St. Peter's will fill up with people coming to pay their respects to Pope Francis. It will fill up again for his funeral. It will fill up again when people are waiting to see if a new pope has been elected. It can hold tens and tens and tens of thousands of people. And then there's a huge sort of triumphal road right the way down to the Tiber of the Via della Conciliazione, which can take hundreds of thousands more people. So it's a great space there. And it's a great space that can hold, I think, St. Peter's can hold both people's grief and people's joy. It's a really wonderful place for people to gather, and that's where people will be going today.
Catherine, just to bring yourself in, now that, of course, we are looking at the Vatican, it will be an area with, as Reverend Marcus said, an area that is very, very busy over the coming weeks and months. But actually, Pope Francis will be the first pope for more than a century to be buried outside the Vatican, won't he? He instead will be buried at the Basilica of St. Mary Major. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, in keeping, as we said before, with Pope Francis, quite a maverick, rogue, and it was his choice. And you've spoken about the many visitors arriving. Of course, we have the big event in the Catholic Church of the canonisation of Carlo Acutis coming up on Sunday. So I don't know what this will do to that, but that seems like something that may need to be moved because of the death of the Pope, but I don't honestly know. So
I actually do have the answers to that. It said, the Reuters news agency has said that has been suspended due to the death of Pope Francis. So you're absolutely right, that will be suspended.
Yeah.
May I come in here about where he's chosen to be buried?
Yes. Of course.
Santa Maggiore, St. Mary Major, is one of the 4 big papal basilicas of Rome, and it was by far Pope Francis's favourite. There's an icon in there, really ancient icon of the Virgin Mary, which he would go to pray before every visit where he left Rome, and after returning to it. He would make a particular visit to that church, and it's an absolutely ancient church. It's 5th century. It's got some of the most beautiful mosaics and this wonderful icon, and he spent lots of time praying privately in that church, so that will be why he's chosen to be buried there.
Why do you think that church specifically spoke to him? Was it its age, perhaps its relative simplicity?
Yes, I think that it isn't very simple. It is covered in gold.
One of the 4 grand Catholic, I completely accept that point.
It's filled with spectacular golden mosaics, so it's not especially simple, but it is very old, and it's got this icon that he was particularly devoted to of the Mother of God, of Mary, and
stories like that are so beautiful. So sorry to interrupt.
That's right,
I just think they're so lovely to hear that, and I think that's what the people love to hear, is that devotion, and to have that personal devotion to Our Lady, and to have his burial place there marked by that devotion is really wonderful. Yeah.
And so there are 4 basilicas through Rome, not including the including the Vatican. And are they sort of
they're dotted around Rome. One is the Cathedral of Rome, St John Lateran. One is Santa Maria Maggiore. There you've got St Peter's Basilica, and you've got St Paul's outside the walls, where St Paul is buried. Peter and Paul are the twin patron saints of Rome, and they've each got a special charism. They've interestingly, each got a special protector from the monarchs or indeed presidents of Europe, and historically it was the King of Spain who looked after Santa Maria Maggiore, and slightly awkwardly, perhaps the first gold from the New World came and lines the ceiling of that church. So possibly that's one of the reasons why
of course, as a Spanish-speaking, American-born Pope, the first, of course, from Latin America, first from Americas at all, that certainly does seem more fitting. I mean, the more that we hear now, perhaps it isn't that surprising that this particular basilica has been chosen. Although, of course, the majority of popes, I would assume, have chosen the Vatican itself as their final resting place.
Yes, to be near the fishermen. The first Pope, St Peter, to be in those grounds there. You do have some popes who are not there. You've got a particularly amusing sculpture by Michelangelo of Pope Julius the Terrible, where he's lying on his tomb and looks sort of paint me like one of your French girls.
Now, is that a posthumous sort of name that he was given?
Yes.
Tell us a little about... Sorry, what was his name again?
Pope Julius II, Pope Julius the Terrible.
Right.
Terrible by name, terrible by nature?
Terrible by name, terrible by nature. He declared a crusade against Bologna, and because they wouldn't pay him a salt tax. He definitely he enjoyed a vibrant sexual life, and varied. And Erasmus wrote the great Dutch scholar and wit. Erasmus wrote an absolutely scathing sort of play on his death, the exclusion of Julius, as he can't get into heaven, and. It's still witty even today.
These are the sort of stories that are inevitable in a what was the word other than institution that you used earlier?
Organism.
An organism that has waxed and waned, that has gone in sort of so many different directions over the course of its, well, almost 2,000 years of history.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. There's lots of stories, and there's lots of gossip and discussion, and it's rife. You'll see it today over the next few days, and everybody has an opinion on the Catholic Church. Was it Archbishop Fulton Sheen who said 98% of people hate what they think the Church is, but what they hate isn't actually the Church. So there's a lot of perception, and I would say a lot of misperception. And you talked about the Pope in America. The Pope's been a controversial figure in America, and some of the cardinals that he has promoted have been a surprise to the American Church. So obviously, with the new presidency in America, there's been there's an apparent conflict which wasn't there when Joe Biden was president. So he has been a controversial figure there, and actually we've seen it in the money that's dried up in the donations coming into the church. So, you know, we talk about the fruits. There's lots and lots of good things, but we have seen the drop in seminarians going into the church and so on, and some of the financial irregularities and problems. So it's a mixed picture.
Okay. Well, Catherine Bennett, thank you so much for joining us. We will rejoin you in a later hour in the show. Reverend Marcus Walker, thank you so much for joining us as well this afternoon. But now we can go to Glasgow to speak to our Scotland reporter, Tony Maguire, who has more there for us. Tony, what's the atmosphere there like in Glasgow?
Yeah, good morning. You know, it's an interesting one for Glasgow because obviously the point of division is the point of religion is usually a moment of division. But as you're about to hear just now, certainly the people of Glasgow coming together to pay their respects to Pope Francis.
Pope has died this morning.
Oh, I know, that's sad.
I've seen pictures of him yesterday, but it didn't look too good. So
they expected him to die about 7 weeks ago. It was death's door. Then he made a recovery, but no. Well, picked a good day to die.
So crazy, so crazy timing. Okay, no, yeah, we didn't even know, so you told us.
There you go.
Mum's Catholic, my dad's Protestant, so, but yeah, sad news obviously for a lot of people all over the world, exactly, yeah.
So I'm not shocked that he has died. He has been ill. There might be some symbolic in it happening on Easter Monday, but wherever he is, I hope he has found rest.
You know, it's interesting. I heard a bit of a conversation in my ear there about, you know, the misconceptions around the church, and you know, for a lot of reasons, Pope Francis was very much a person driving it forward. This is the first Latin American man to be pope. This is the first pope to appear in the cover of Rolling Stone with, you know, interest in chemistry, and you know, he has spent many a year teaching both literature and psychology, and very much, you know, avant-garde for his time. And I think a lot of people will very much miss the man. Certainly here in Glasgow, behind me you can see the Metropolitan Cathedral of St Andrews, the Catholic Cathedral here in Glasgow. Any moment now, a special Easter Monday service will begin to mark this day, and a sad loss for the Catholics around the world.
It is, of course, such a significant day, such a significant moment. But of course, there will also be so many people thinking, well, what happens next? There has been this tension within the Catholic Church. There's been pushing and pulling from one way to the other, the more liberal direction of Pope Francis, more conservative voices being somewhat concerned about that direction. And I suppose that is something of an allegory for the world as it stands right now.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I think that point of division, of competing views and influences, and you know, what we're seeing, I would say today, is a lot of a closer marrying of the borders between religion and politics, especially now with Donald Trump and JD Vance being as forthcoming about their political stances as they are. And what that's doing is the headlines are now becoming a marriage of political and religious headlines. And very much I think that could be true for a lot of places. And you look in Scotland, obviously some of our more less than liberal Christians here in Scotland have obviously been behind many of the movements against praying outside abortion centres and airing their views on gay marriage, as well as the whole matter of abortion in Scotland. And now we are in this very interesting phase where the next Pope is going to come in and they're going to have all this to deal with. They're going to have all of this to pick up and make sure that this is going to be a question for future generations to ask as well.
Well, Tony, it has been a peculiar day, I have to say. I was not expecting this morning to be reading of the passing of the Pope. It seemed that he was getting better, but what a moment to look back upon his life and indeed his legacy. Tony Maguire, thank you indeed for joining us live from Glasgow. We'll be catching up with you a little bit later in the programme. We will indeed. Now, the time is coming up to 1 o'clock on Monday, the 21st of April. I'm Sophie Reaper. And I'm Tom Harwood.
Now, throughout the afternoon, we will be bringing you continued coverage of the death of Pope Francis, who's passed away aged 88. The Pontiff had experienced a string of health worries in recent years and spent 38 days in hospital in February and March of this year. But only yesterday, he greeted crowds on Easter Sunday in St. Peter's Square.
Well, throughout the show today, we'll be bringing you the latest reaction as tributes pour in from around the globe. We'll also have expert analysis, as well as any developments as crowds continue to gather in their thousands outside the Vatican. And, of course, over the course of the next few weeks, around 130 cardinal electors will make their way to the Vatican from around the world ahead of that highly anticipated papal conclave. There is indeed so much to look back on and indeed to examine, and that is what we're bringing you here on GB News throughout the afternoon.
Indeed, and as you mentioned, Tom, I think this came as quite surprising news this morning. He went into hospital back on February 14th of this year, didn't he, and with a double pneumonia, but it did seem perhaps that he was making a recovery. The Vatican keeping us all updated with daily updates on the Pope's health. Of course, he's been meeting a string of political and significant figures from around the world in the past days and weeks, including yesterday meeting the Vice President of the US, J.D. Vance. So, as we say, perhaps this did come as a bit of surprise, but as our previous guest said, it may have been that Pope Francis was simply trying to get through the most significant day in the Christian calendar of Easter Sunday yesterday, and now an incredibly poignant time for him to have passed away aged 88.
Yeah, absolutely. The timing, I mean, you just couldn't write something like this. Well, do stay with us here on GB News for continued live coverage of the reaction around the world to the death of Pope Francis. Well, we'll get a roundup of the latest news headlines now with Sophia Wensler.
Tom, Sophie, thank you. Good afternoon. It's just gone 1 o'clock. These are your headlines. Now, as you've been hearing, the King has sent heartfelt condolences and profound sympathy following the death of Pope Francis at the age of 88. The Pontiff, who was Bishop of Rome and head of the Catholic Church, spent 12 years in the Vatican after becoming Pope in 2013. His death was announced by Cardinal Farrell in a statement released by the Vatican this morning, who said his entire life was dedicated to the service of the Lord and his Church. It comes just one day after he made a surprise appearance at the Vatican's Easter Sunday service, blessing crowds in St. Peter's Square. In recent years, his papacy has been marked by concerns about his health, with a 5-week hospital stay for an infection that developed into double pneumonia. The Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, has posted on X saying he is deeply saddened to hear of the death of His Holiness, describing the late Pontiff as a pope for the poor, the downtrodden and the forgotten. Meanwhile, the associate editor of the Catholic Herald, Simon Caldwell, told GB News the Catholic Church is likely to move away from Pope Francis's progressive leadership.
It hasn't left a very united church. Not everybody has identified with the agenda of Francis. So I think that will be reflected in the conclave. I mean, Francis has chosen many cardinals who he thinks will uphold his legacy. But they will, in the end, they're going to do what they think is right. And I would be surprised if we have a Francis too. I really would.
In other news, Russian drone attacks have been reported across Ukraine just hours after the end of a 30-hour Easter truce was declared by Moscow. Ukraine's Air Force issued air raid alerts for the eastern half of the country, while in the southern city of Mykolaiv, explosions were heard. It was not immediately clear whether there were any casualties. It follows a brief Easter truce declared by Vladimir Putin, which both Ukraine and Russia accused each other of breaching. The UK government has dismissed the ceasefire as a one-day stunt, backing Ukraine's call for a longer pause. Meanwhile, US President Donald Trump has said he hopes Russia and Ukraine will make a deal this week. And pressure is growing for the Prime Minister to break his silence on the Supreme Court's ruling that biological sex defines a woman. Sir Keir Starmer has been accused of refusing to stop a plot by ministers to thwart the landmark gender judgment. Labour MPs are reportedly plotting to circumvent the judgment in leaked WhatsApp messages. It's understood Number 10 has not taken action against those involved, insisting the messages aren't an attempt to undermine the court's decision. It comes after trans rights activists gathered for an emergency demonstration over the weekend, where multiple statues were defaced, including that of feminist hero Millicent Fawcett. Home Secretary Yvette Cooper has slammed the vandalism as disgraceful, but Sir Keir Starmer is yet to comment. Those are the latest GB News headlines. More in half an hour.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Well, good afternoon to you, and it is a breaking news day, an unusual day here on GB News. Instead of your regular programming, it's continued coverage, of course, of the death of Pope Francis, who passed away aged 88.
Indeed, and as we were saying just a few moments ago, it is quite a surprising day. It did seem perhaps that Pope Francis's health was taking a turn for the better, despite him dealing with health battles in recent years, but particularly in recent months. So to talk a bit more about that now, we're joined by the Associate Editor of The Spectator, Damien Thompson. Damien, thank you so much for joining us in the studio. A surprising day of news, the death of Pope Francis after 12 years as the Pope. What do you think his legacy will be?
His legacy will be a complicated one, and I'm aware that saying that on a day when he's sadly just died and literally hundreds of millions of people are mourning him is perhaps rather controversial, but it will be a complicated legacy because he was, and intended to be in some respects, a divisive Pope. He moved sharply against traditionalists banning their Latin liturgy. He signed a deal with China, which the Vatican says was a great success, but has in fact handed over almost complete control, in fact, total control of the Catholic Church in China to the Chinese Communist Party. At the same time, his campaigning on behalf of the poor and the marginalized was obviously heartfelt and obviously did have an effect on world opinion. His views on climate change were expressed vociferously. He changed Catholic teaching, which is a very unusual thing for a pope to do, in order to ban the death penalty, which is something that many people, including myself, would welcome. So, as I say, a complicated legacy, but above all, and this is the point that I make with tremendous trepidation on the day that the poor man has just died after showing considerable courage, very difficult questions will have to be answered by Catholics over the next few weeks over Pope Francis's role in covering up terrible sexual assaults by people who are allies of him. And it's unfortunate that I tweeted something out this morning. It's unfortunate that demanding justice for the victims of those people, allies of Francis, is something that can't really wait and can perhaps now happen, because what was stopping people like the dreadful accused serial rapist Father Marco Rupnik, or the supposedly jailed, but it seems now escaped Bishop Gustavo Zanchetta, a gay sexual predator in Argentina, was the influence of the Pope. And that's going to be very difficult for Catholics to come to terms with.
This has been a scandal that has rocked the Catholic Church across many different popes. Defenders of Pope Francis would say he was very quick to defrock the US Cardinal Theodore McCarrick.
No, he wasn't.
He did defrock?
He did defrock him, yeah.
But he was not fast?
He was not fast to do it at all. Very much the opposite. Theodore McCarrick had been essentially sent into exile by Pope Benedict, who didn't do enough. I mean, but you know, McCarrick wasn't technically accused of crimes. So, you know, he could at least present it as sex between, or sexual contact between consenting adults or whatever. It wasn't until he was charged with an assault against a minor that Francis got round to defrocking him. But in the meantime, he brought McCarrick, whose reputation was absolutely notorious, out of retirement and sent him around the world as his emissary. And among other things, it was McCarrick who helped negotiate the appalling Chinese deal, which has seen effectively Chinese Catholics handed over to their persecutors. But I'm sorry to sound such a negative tone about Pope Francis, so may I just add that I think all of us were horrified by his suffering and greatly impressed with his determination. He ruled with a rod of iron. I sometimes compare him, he wouldn't like this at all, I sometimes compare him to Donald Trump. The two men have much more in common than you might think.
Really?
Francis was the most authoritarian pope for centuries. And they both had a huge personality cult, which in some ways they cultivated. And they were men of iron determination. Nobody could feel entirely safe working for them. I mean, both of them, had a long history of sacking people who disagree with them, and often very unexpectedly. So, but I think the suffering of Francis in his last days was agonizing to watch, and his determination to survive was profoundly impressive.
This has been a very difficult papacy for conservative Catholics.
Yes.
But what I find, speaking as a non-Catholic, difficult to sort of marry up, is the idea that you have a pope at the head of the church that you must listen to, that is the leader of your church, and as a Catholic, as a more conservative Catholic, might think that the role of the Pope is perhaps more important than the more liberal-minded Catholics. And is that not a strange sort of tension, pulling in two different ways over the last 12 years?
Well, there's a sort of paradox of the Francis pontificate, which is that everybody calls him a liberal. He supported the left on many issues, and he supported liberals where it would cause disruption as he wanted to see. For example, in the American church, which he couldn't stand, so he appointed a series of ultra-liberal cardinals. What he didn't do was change the Catholic position on homosexuality, or at least there was a sort of half-hearted attempt to allow gay blessings, which was started by his doctrinal chief, and which Francis had basically reversed. He didn't change the line on female deacons. He didn't really change Catholic moral or sexual teaching. I mean, it's not clear whether he changed the line on divorced people receiving communion. What he did do is he raised the hopes of lots of liberals and then dashed them. And so what we are left with is a church that is profoundly wounded, but also very confused.
I'd just like to ask, you said earlier that it will be a complicated legacy. We will, of course, now go through the electoral conclave process to replace Pope Francis. What would you like to see from his replacement? One of our guests earlier this afternoon described Pope Francis as a hinge pope, one that perhaps came in and made a change in terms of the direction of the papacy. What would you like to see from the next pope?
Well, if he was a hinge pope, the door was swinging wildly in both directions, I have to say. What I would like to see from the next pope, personally, is somebody who is neither liberal nor conservative, but who is a holy man who doesn't rock the boat on hot-button issues that cannot be resolved. We've seen them tear the Church of England into tiny pieces, but who preaches the gospel in a simple and appealing way, who removes the restrictions on the celebration of the ancient liturgy, the Tridentine Mass, because they're so popular with young people, who understands that that sort of countercultural thing is important. Who doesn't say cruel or divisive things, sort of things that you sometimes hear from African bishops talking about gay people, for example, which horrify me, but also who doesn't follow a secular progressive agenda and do. I mean, Francis from time to time would just. It seemed like he'd get NGOs to come in and write his speeches for him. And I was never clear, by the way, whether Pope Francis, who was not a great reader in later years, had actually read some of the documents that appeared under his name.
I think one of his main encyclicals. Did I say that correctly?
You did.
Encyclicals was against environmental degradation. Sort of this circular letter sent to the church, sort of talking about how the environment must be stewarded. It was seen as controversial. It was seen as perhaps political. Although you could argue that, well, conservation is in the role of what he's supposed to do.
You certainly could argue that it is the role of the church to try and preserve the planet, to urge politicians to make the right decisions. It is not necessarily the role of the church to advocate, as it did under Francis, specific and highly contested policies. Same applies to migration.
Yes, his first visit as Pope was to Lampedusa.
Exactly.
To see that, which is the awful concentration of migrants coming from Africa to Europe.
He encouraged unchecked migration into Europe, and that was not a good thing. And he did not seem interested in any of the critiques, not made by racists or nationalists necessarily, but just by ordinary people, of the tremendous burden on our society that unchecked and illegal migration is putting on.
This has made things difficult, given in recent days, of course, he met J.D. Vance.
Yeah.
He's also met with Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy, who's taken a very hard view on illegal migration. Yeah. When Donald Trump was standing for the presidency in his first term, he talked a lot about building a wall. And Pope Francis released a statement saying that the church is not about is about bringing down walls, not about putting them up, which seemed like an almost extraordinary intervention in a political process.
This is what I mean by saying he's like Donald Trump. He can't resist a dig, or couldn't. And it's a shame to speak of him in the past tense. You know, even those who are most critical of him feel his absence. He's no longer there anymore, and it's rather shocking. But anyway, this is what I mean. He couldn't resist a dig. Fine, you can oppose the building of the wall. I think it's nuts to oppose the policies that President Trump has finally put into practice with the strong support of the American people. But, you know, we can argue about that. What bothered me was that the Pope could get worked up about that and say not one word about China's grotesque abuses of human rights, because the Vatican had done a disgraceful deal with China, the architect of which, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, is in the running to be the next Pope, and God help us if he is.
Oh, before we must end this conversation soon, but I'm just fascinated on your thoughts about who else is in the running to be the next Pope. What might the next papacy look like, particularly given that Pope Francis appointed a great number of cardinals, perhaps from a less traditional vein than you might have expected?
His appointments were quite chaotic, and often he'd appoint cardinals from the peripheries whose views he hadn't necessarily checked out. So I'm not sure that the conclave is going to be as liberal as all that.
Some of these African...
exactly, and people from... it's a weird situation where, Ireland doesn't have a cardinal, Australia doesn't have a cardinal, but Tonga does. Anyway, my point is, there are people who are neither left nor right who are very interesting, such as, for example, Cardinal Pizzaballa of Jerusalem, the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, who's a profoundly dignified, exceptionally clever, charming and holy man who isn't partisan. And I hope the cardinals will be looking for somebody like that. The Conservatives will have almost no hope, the hardline Conservatives have almost no hope, simply because Francis made sure that there weren't enough of them in the conclave. But there aren't enough hardline liberals for them to get their man in.
Very interesting to hear from you, Associate Editor of The Spectator, Damien Thompson. Thank you so much for joining us in the studio this afternoon.
Well, as we've been reporting throughout the programme today, Pope Francis, the head of the Catholic Church, has died.
He was the first pope from both the Western Hemisphere and South America ascending to the papacy in 2013 as the figurehead of the world's 1.3 billion Catholics. Cameron Walker takes a look back on the life of an extraordinary man.
March 2013, and Jorge Mario Bergoglio stood on the balcony of St. Peter's in Rome and said a simple Buonasera.
Fratelli e sorelle, grazie tante dell'accoglienza.
It was the start of a very different pontificate from his predecessor Benedict, who'd retired from his onerous duties. The former Archbishop of Buenos Aires was the first pope to take the name of Francis, the saint of the poor and of nature. He was, though, to usher in a time of richer relations with his worldwide congregation, both in style and substance. And that soon became evident as he made his presence in the Vatican more accessible. Gone were the grand papal apartments. He moved to the Casa Santa Marta to live simply with others. When he visited the headquarters of the EU, he did so in a battered car, and a more informal approach echoed the approach of John Paul II. The carnival is over, he declared, referring to the Vatican's cliques and factions. There was instead a whirling circus of high-profile media appearances. The Pope wanted to be part of the modern world. He was clearly spontaneous and open. When asked about homosexuality, he answered, "Who am I to judge?" But did indeed pass judgment publicly on those who had been abused.
Faccio un sentito appello per la lotta a tutto campo contro gli abusi di minori nel campo sessuale come in altri campi, da parte di tutte le autorità e delle singole persone, perché si tratta di crimini abominevoli che vanno cancellati dalla faccia della terra.
This was one of his earliest challenges, how to deal with the spectre of child abuse that had hung over the Catholic Church. His papacy became an opportunity to end decades of evasion and cover-ups. But traditionalists were fearful of his modernizing tendencies, affirming in their view, when he banned the Latin Mass, a form of liturgy popular with conservative Catholics.
Buon pranzo e arrivederci.
He went on to speak one then of Muslims as brothers, and was vocal in his support of migrants, even taking in some families to live in the Vatican itself. He also pitted himself against African Orthodox bishops on the issue of homosexuality, where Pope Francis went further than his predecessors. Although he never actually blessed the concept of gay marriage, he appeared to observe the rule of love above the rule of law. In a documentary for the Disney Plus channel, he also reflected that priests should be merciful towards women seeking an abortion. As the world was gripped by the COVID crisis, Francis publicly encouraged all Catholics to get vaccinated. He called this a small gesture of love in poverty, at a time when skepticism was sweeping parts of the globe. But the death toll was rising, especially across his home continent of South America. He felt the need for practical as well as spiritual leadership. With the invasion of Ukraine, the Vatican needed to deliver its own message in the war of words between Russia and the West.
Questa bandiera viene dalla guerra, proprio da quella città martoriata, Bucha.
Pope Francis denounced the wake of death and destruction, describing the war as a crime against God and humanity. He warned of a rising nuclear threat, echoing the views of millions when he said the world once more feels fear and anguish.
Per favore, non dimentichiamo di pregare per la martoriata Ucraina.
But despite this continued spiritual strength, his physical being was weakening. Knee problems left him using a wheelchair for long periods. In the summer of 2021, he underwent abdominal surgery, and then bronchitis hospitalized him in the spring of 2023. It was acknowledgement of his increasing frailty. He felt a malaise, he said, but I wasn't afraid. And he continued with his duties in all humility. He had admitted drafting a letter of resignation in the event of illness, making it impossible for him to continue with his duties as Benedict had done. But then, in a more recent interview, he reflected he had no real intention of taking that step. His ministry, he said, was his life.
Well, that was looking back at the life of Pope Francis by our correspondent Cameron Walker. Pope Francis, of course, has died today, Easter Monday, at the age of 88.
Indeed, and reactions have, of course, been pouring in from politicians throughout the morning and into the afternoon. So to tell us a bit more about that, joining us in the studio is our political correspondent, Catherine Forster. Catherine, in the last hour or so, we've heard from the President of the US, Donald Trump. What did he have to say about the death of Pope Francis?
Yes, so Donald Trump posting on his Truth Social in the last few minutes. Rest in peace, Pope Francis, exclamation mark. May God bless him and all who loved him, exclamation mark. The White House had put out a similar sentiment a couple of hours ago, along with a picture of Donald Trump and Pope Francis with Melania as well, when Pope Francis was a bit younger. Also, J.D. Vance, who met Pope Francis just yesterday. We've also heard in the last few minutes from the former US President, Joe Biden, who has described Pope Francis as one of the most consequential leaders of our time. Goes on to say he was unlike any who came before him. J.D. Vance posted some time ago, of course, he was literally in Rome meeting Pope Francis only yesterday. They met briefly, and J.D. Vance said, "My heart goes out to the millions of Christians all over the world who loved him. I was happy to see him yesterday, though he was obviously very ill." Worth saying that J.D. Vance converted to Catholicism about 6 years ago. Also worth saying that the Pope has been quite outspoken in that he was not happy about some of the anti-immigration measures being taken by the current US administration.
Now, Catherine, those are, of course, voices coming from America. What have we heard, perhaps a bit closer to home, European leaders, for example?
Yes, well, our own Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, has said his leadership in a complex and challenging time for the world and the Church was courageous, yet always came from a place of deep humility. He described him as a pope for the poor, the downtrodden and the forgotten. We've also heard from President Macron of France. He has said, from Buenos Aires to Rome, Pope Francis wanted to bring joy and hope to the poorest. May it unite people with each other. May this hope continually revive beyond him. Also, Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, has put out a message, and she has said, "The Pope's death makes me deeply sad. He was a great man and a great shepherd." Worth saying, too, that we have heard from Vladimir Putin today, who has sent his most sincere condolences and has said that Pope Francis actively promoted the development of dialogue between the Russian Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches, as well as constructive cooperation between Russia and the Holy See. So a huge number of world figures all paying tribute to clearly quite an extraordinary individual.
Absolutely, and this is one of those moments, I think we were speaking a little bit earlier, that everyone will remember where they were this morning when they learnt this news. Of course, all world leaders are having their say too on a perhaps uniquely political Pope.
Yes, he was. He was modern and he was outspoken in a way that many others hadn't been. He wanted to live very simply. He wasn't interested in all the trappings of wealth. He went to Lampedusa, one of the Italian islands that had so many migrants. And, you know, only yesterday we're told that there was an exchange of opinions between the Pope's aides and J.D. Vance and his officials about, quote, difficult humanitarian situations with particular attention to migrants, refugees and prisoners. So the Pope felt very strongly that he was there more than anybody for the poorest, the most disadvantaged, the most vulnerable. And in fact, he sent an open letter to American bishops just in February urging Catholics to to reject the sort of anti-immigration narratives and behaviour that he sees coming from the US administration. So, yes, interesting that J.D. Vance, the last global figure, in fact, to meet him.
Well, Catherine, thank you so much for joining us. Of course, we're looking at pictures, if you're watching on television, of the Vatican there. And interestingly, in the last few minutes, we've had some breaking news from the Vatican. The Pope Francis's body could be moved to St. Peter's Basilica as early as Wednesday, allowing the faithful to pay their respects. That's from Vatican spokesman Matteo Bruni. And he has also added that a group of cardinals meeting on Tuesday are expected to take a formal decision on that issue.
And of course, we're looking at the famous dome of St. Peter's Basilica there in our live pictures from the Vatican on the left of our screens. But let's take a look a little bit closer to home now. Delighted to say that we can be joined by Anna Riley, our Yorkshire and the Humber reporter, because Anna, you've been testing the mood up there in Leeds.
Yes, Tom, very sombre mood here in Leeds, of course, with millions of Catholics mourning the loss of Pope Francis around the world. People gathering around their local churches, Catholics going to pay their respects and pray for the Pope. Here at Leeds Cathedral, we've been speaking to the Bishop of Leeds, Marcus Stock, and this is the message that he had.
It was a real shock to hear of his death this morning. I gather he died about 7:35. I was actually celebrating Mass at 6:35, so at the time he died in my private chapel. So it was a great sadness that we've all learned of this news. But we are offering this Mass for the Pope's soul, and we'll be saying some prayers for his soul at the end of the Mass itself. I'd say that the Holy Father will be delighted that he died on Easter, at Easter time, because throughout his pontificate, he's talked about the mercy of God, he's talked about the hope of God, and particularly hope for people who feel on the edge of society, people on the peripheries, as he put it. And I think he will recognise the beauty of actually dying at a time of great hope. And I think his life and his death will give hope to others.
The Bishop of Leeds there giving that message of the legacy that Pope Francis has left, and certainly at the moment there's a Mass going on, the Easter Monday Mass, and in which prayers have been said for the Pope. There's a picture of the Pope that's displayed at the front of the church. People have been going up and lighting candles and saying prayers in his memory. So that's what's happening here in Leeds throughout the day. We'll be speaking to Catholics leaving the church as well just about today, and what Pope Francis meant to them and meant to their community here in Leeds.
Well, Anna Riley, thank you so much for being there for us. Speaking, of course, to the bishop there, and really getting a feel for what people across the country, indeed across the world, are feeling today.
Absolutely, and brilliant, of course, from Anna Riley to bring us the voice there from the Bishop at Leeds Cathedral. I'll just bring back our panel now. Church of England clergyman, the Reverend Marcus Walker, as well as co-host of Catholic Unscripted, Catherine Bennett. Thank you very much to you both for joining us again. We just heard there from the Bishop of Leeds Cathedral about the legacy that Pope Francis will leave behind. Could you just touch on that again for us, Father, about how he will be remembered and the impacts that he's had around the world?
Yes, I think that he'll be remembered very much as a hinge pope, moving the church from being very focused on Europe, being the first pope to come from Latin America, from the Southern Hemisphere, reaching out to find cardinals from around the world, not choosing the normal places where cardinals come from. He's really focused his ministry on a very pastoral sort of he's had a very pastoral approach to his ministry, perhaps less theological than his predecessor. very direct and pastoral with great care for the poor, for refugees, for the downtrodden and the outcast. That's, I think, very much what he'll be remembered for. And I think that he's certainly shifted the focus of the Church towards the billions of Catholics who don't live in Europe and come from around the rest of the world.
What do you make of that, Catherine Bennett? The idea that perhaps the Catholic Church has been too Eurocentric, given the growth of the Church in the parts of the world that perhaps are less European.
Yeah, well, first of all, Catholic means universal, so it's one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. And I'm glad that you talked about growth there, Tom, because we have just seen the largest growth in numbers coming into the Church over Easter. And this is just such a wonderful thing to celebrate. And I think it's important to hear the words of somebody like Damien Thompson, who came on and spoke very seriously about the legacy of Pope Francis, and these things are not to be overlooked and ignored. But God is in charge, ultimately, and I've heard testimonies from priests saying that their ministry and confession has changed, with more people feeling able to come in because Francis has emphasised mercy, and they have said that they're not as frightened as they once were. So anything in his legacy that has meant people have not kept away but instead been able to recognise the mercy of God is a good thing and to be celebrated, but not to overlook those things that have been problematic. And they may be more problematic for those inside the Church who are very hungry for certainty.
Is there a bit of a theological tension with regard to forgive me if I'm wrong on this, but I think of the Catholic Church as quite a hierarchical organisation.
Organism.
And Pope Francis sort of... is there something a bit more Lutheran about him? Is there something a bit sort of less hierarchical about the man at the top of the hierarchy? It seems to me such a peculiar tension.
The People's Pope, as he was described.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily a tension, but I can see how it is seen as such. Ultimately, hierarchy is important, whether we're looking at a family, whether it's a workplace, whether it's just a reality that we structured in hierarchy. Hierarchy, though Christ shows us in the Gospels, he showed us on Maundy Thursday what that looks like. To lead is to serve. So he knelt and washed the feet of his disciples. So I think what Pope Francis was doing was trying to take the notion of hierarchy away from... Now, whether he achieved this or not, because there's questions to be asked, and I know it's certainly the case that one could say he was rather tyrannical. However, he was trying to give the impression of the role being one of service, which it is, of course. You know, and we look at the issue of women priests, which has come up again and again in the Church, and there are still so many people pushing that direction. It will never happen. It will never happen. But the fact that it won't happen is nothing to do with hate or a lack of equality, but it's just about a right understanding of role and authority. And too often authority is misunderstood as power. So I would say Christ shows us that right way of service, and I think that's what Pope Francis was trying to emphasise.
Now, here's an interesting distinction, because, of course, we have an Anglican clergyman on the panel as well, and Father Marcus, you're a member of the General Synod of the Church of England, which recently did vote to allow women bishops, and this is a point of difference, a point of clear difference now between your two churches.
Yes, it is, and I'm very pleased that we did, and I'm very pleased that my church is in the Diocese of London, and we have Bishop Sarah Mullally as our bishop. It is a point of difference, and I think one of the interesting elements of Pope Francis's pontificate has been the serious growth in ecumenical relations between, and improvement in ecumenical relations between the Catholic Church and other churches. I was working in that for 4 years, in the relationships between the Church of England, well, the Anglican Communion and the Catholic Church, and he was hugely open to that and used to speak incredibly powerfully about how he would work with Anglican priests in Argentina. He allowed the first ever choral evensong to take place in St. Peter's Basilica on the anniversary of his election as Pope.
Which you organised?
Which I organised. It was great fun. So hearing the wonderful words of Cranmer and the music of the Anglican choral tradition in St. Peter's was wonderful, and balanced with High Mass at the High Altar of Canterbury Cathedral celebrated by a cardinal for the first time since the Reformation. So we had great steps together towards recognising the Christian in each other, the essential reality of our baptism as being valid in each other under Pope Francis. And he had a great relationship with Justin Welby, and it's really interesting, Justin Welby and Pope Francis were elected almost on the same day.
And a lot of parallels could be drawn between the two men.
A lot of parallels. You've got the interesting thing, both succeeded a great theologian. Both actually made a bit of a point of not being very interested in theology. Pope Francis, in his first meeting with Justin Welby, said to him, "You do realise that I am senior to you?" And Justin Welby sort of took a step back, thinking, well, this is a bit fierce. And then the Pope went, "By one day." His installation election was preceded Justin's by one day.
Wow.
But they had a great relationship over their 10 years and did a lot together around the world.
Although, of course, both were rocked by scandal as well, and a very similar scandal at that for both men. But do stay with us, both Father Marcus and Catherine Bennett. We will be back with you very shortly indeed. But joining us now is our correspondent Cameron Walker, live outside Westminster Cathedral for us, because Cameron, this has been a moment for people around the world to sort of go to places like Westminster Cathedral, to places of Catholic places of worship, and pay their respects.
Yes, Tom, and they certainly have. There's been hundreds of people inside the cathedral in the last hour for a special mass put on following the death of Pope Francis, joining together in a moment of sombre prayer. The Holy See flag above the building has been lowered to half-mast as well, and we've heard in the last hour from the Vatican itself saying that Pope Francis's body could be moved to St. Peter's Basilica as early as Wednesday. But we have spoken to a number of Catholics who have gathered here outside Westminster Cathedral, the focal point here in the United Kingdom, really, of the Catholic Church, to pay their respects to Pope Francis, and this is what they told us.
It was not any pope, it's our pope, it was our pope, and well, I think it's the best for him because he stopped feeling well, or he was very ill, so I think it's the best for him.
And how do you think his legacy will be remembered?
A pope that made lots of changes, and he was very brave, and well, he was a strong man with conviction.
It's certainly a very devastating news. He's the Holy Father, he's the head of the Church Universal, and I think all Catholic faithful in the world must be devastated hearing this news today. I think it might be too early to make a statement about his legacy now, but I'm quite confident his pontificate will be one of the most important pontificates in the modern history of the Church.
He was elected. I was also as a tourist here in London, and I came to this place when we saw that the smoke was white, and we all want to know who is the new Pope. So I'm very moved that today I hear that he's entered immortality.
Well, Pope Francis passed away at the age of 88 at 7:35 this morning, local time, to the Vatican, the first Latin American Pope in history. And world leaders have been paying tribute to Pope Francis from around the world, including the King, who said he and the Queen were most deeply saddened to learn of the death of Pope Francis and were greatly moved to have been able to visit him earlier in the month. President Donald Trump of the United States has also written on his social media platform saying, "Rest in peace, Pope Francis. May God bless him and all who loved him." Now, the Pope's funeral arrangements are, some of them at least, are public. He wants, for example, a very modest coffin, or a modest coffin with simple wood rather than perhaps the traditional lead and oak, which would be expected from popes of the past. He also doesn't want to be buried in the usual place that popes are buried. Instead, he wants to be buried at Rome's St. Mary Major Basilica. But of course, after 15 days of mourning, the Catholic Church elects a new Pope, and that is known as conclave. The cardinals will gather in Rome. If they are under the age of 80, they can vote for their new Pope. But of course, for now, it is very much about paying tribute to Pope Francis, and as Catholics are doing all around the world.
Well, Cameron Walker, live from Westminster Cathedral. Thanks indeed for joining us.
Absolutely, but to get a bit more now in terms of a local perspective, you might perhaps call it. Joining us now is General Secretary of Churches Together in England, Bishop Mike Royal. Mike, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Talk to me about the legacy of Pope Francis, not just in England, but all over the world.
Yeah, I think Pope Francis will be remembered as a man who held the office with great dignity, but also humility. And in that sense, I think everyday people could really relate to him. And I think he will be remembered for someone who championed the needs of the last and the least. He spoke out about issues around refugees and asylum seekers. He spoke out about climate justice and how it impacted the poorest in the world. And of course, his parting words were calling for a lasting peace in Gaza. And I think that that will very much be his epitaph.
And to some, that will be a relatively controversial legacy, perhaps a more political pope than we've seen in recent decades. A pope that was willing to speak up on these sorts of political issues of migration, of war, and of the climate.
Yes, and I think, as what was previously said, he's a voice. He's the first Latin American pope, a voice from the global south. That's a different perspective, and that came across in the issues that he chose to engage with. But for me, he did it with great humility and humanity. And I think that that enabled people to really connect with him beyond the Catholic Church. So I think there will be people from the wider Christian community, but also people of other faiths and of no faiths at all who will mourn his loss today.
Now, of course, one of your messages at Churches Together in England is encouraging churches from a wide range of traditions to work together in unity. You mentioned there that's perhaps something that Pope Francis was successful in doing. Do you think that's something that we will see in the Pope that will replace him? And if so, is that something you're hoping for?
Yes, I am hoping for that. And, you know, in September 2023, I had the privilege of being in St. Peter's Square when the Pope called a gathering of Christians from around the world as part of his synodality gathering. It was a joyous occasion, but for me summed up his desire to bring the church together as one, and I'm hoping that his successor will seek to do the same.
This is, of course, a moment not just of reflection and of looking back across a transformative 12 years for the Roman Catholic Church, but also one perhaps of looking to the future. It's interesting to see how the sort of world of Catholicism in particular has had perhaps a slight resurgence in recent years, with the congregations growing rather than shrinking. Is that a trajectory that is sustainable, that could continue?
Absolutely, and not just the Catholic Church, but certainly throughout the United Kingdom. I mean, there is now concrete evidence that people are returning to church, and that there is a heightened desire to engage with the Christian faith. And that really excites us all. And churches of all shapes and sizes are reporting that. Obviously, that pleases us at Churches Together in England. And so what's happening in the Catholic Church is also happening in other churches as well.
Well, General Secretary of Churches Together in England, Bishop Mike Royal, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Well, delighted to say that still with us in the studio is the Church of England clergyman, the Reverend Marcus Walker, as well as the co-host of Catholic Unscripted, Catherine Bennett. Catherine, we're going to start with you because this is something that does interest me, this sort of parallels that we were looking at a moment ago between Pope Francis and Justin Welby. It does seem that this is both a remarkable sort of almost identical length of tenure, but also a number of similar criticisms and a number of similar, for want of a better word, fans.
Yes, I think it is an interesting parallel. And while a lot of people today will be talking about the unification and how humble Pope Francis was, as I've mentioned already, we simply can't overlook the fact that this is not necessarily an accurate picture of his pontificate. You quoted Margaret Thatcher earlier, who quoted St Francis, "Where there is discord, may I bring harmony." And Pope Francis, in one of his earliest speeches at World Youth Day in 2013, is famous for saying "Hagen Loy" or something, which is "make a mess." And I would make a mess. That's what he said in World Youth Day. And I know that Catholics would, many Catholics would say, actually, for all the good he's done, and there is much, and he's defended life and so on, a mess has been made. And I think we are at this time where we need that fire of Pentecost. We need to bring people together under the confidence of a solid and strong Pope, because unfortunately, I think that there has been, as far as I can see, a bit more division than unification under Pope Francis.
Well, Reverend Marcus Walker will bring you in. Now, is that something you agree with what Catherine said there? And if so, do you think there needs to be a change when we have a replacement for Pope Francis?
I think Pope Francis, coming from Latin America, was acutely aware of a number of the serious challenges that the Catholic Church faces in the coming years and decades. There is a huge paucity, a huge lack of numbers of priests coming forward. He saw this particularly in places like Brazil, where I think there's some astonishing number of priests to people that's, like one priest per 100,000. There are more priests who are former priests because they've gone off to get married. He really wanted to engage with a lot of these questions and tried to open these questions up to the wider church to have discussions about things like married priests and about divorce and remarriage and questions like that. In the doing that, I think, looking on from outside, a mess was made in that a lot of people started discussing these things and quite often quite aggressively. And possibly this is my Church of England sort of voice speaking here, having those discussions is really important. And actually he did have those, and he did start those conversations. I'm not sure they've ended, but if the Church doesn't start asking itself how it is going to be able to engage with the practical realities of the world as it's coming up, how do you minister sacraments if you don't have people going into the priesthood? How do you, it's going to be in trouble. And I think Pope Francis saw that and tried to work out how to wrestle with those. That wasn't without cost.
Well, I would say there is actually a huge growth in some of the more orthodox and traditional seminarians and in some of the more traditional, orthodox communities in the Catholic Church. And I think young people, again, are hungry, they're starving, they're yearning for certainty. And you spoke about authority, and Pope Francis made a mess, and we have to look at these questions. I would say I think there's definitely a sense of looking with a horizontal lens, so it's looking from a worldly perspective. And in that sense, I think he probably was incredibly popular because the things he was saying fitted very well with looking and focusing on diversity and inclusivity and equity. But I think there's also a sense that we might have missed the vertical, which is the look not with earthly and manly eyes, but with heavenly eyes. And I think what the Church, there's a sense that maybe Pope Francis has come in, and before Pope Francis, there was no care for homosexual persons, there was no care for LGBT people, there was no care for women. And in fact, that's not true, because the Church teaches the truth and loves and teaches love. So to the extent that Pope Francis' pontificate has cause people to think he is offering something new, I think is a shame, because the church has never taught hate for anybody at all. Where that teaching of love hasn't been as clear as it might have been, you know, that can be discussed. But it's certainly not he wasn't bringing something new that hadn't always existed.
Now, I should say we're looking at live pictures of the Vatican. We're looking at St. Peter's Basilica, of course, there in the distance, that famous dome, and this most holy site for Catholics around the world. Father Marcus Walker, you were the sort of Anglican Communion's man in Rome for some time. What is it like there? What will be going on now behind the scenes? What can we expect over the coming days and weeks?
Rome is a very curious city in that it is, as a city in Italy, it is entirely geared around the ceremonies of a different state, the Vatican, that sort of sits within it. So all of the big ceremonial processions and all of the big buildings are actually not the buildings of the state of Italy. They are the buildings of the Vatican. And it's designed, really, or not, I mean, it has grown up rather than being consciously designed. It has grown up to be a place that can hold the emotions of an event like this, of the death of a pope, for example, or the joy of an Easter, of Easter celebrations. But right now, the city is going to have to hold a lot of grief, and hundreds of thousands and possibly millions of people will now descend on Rome in order to pay their respects to Pope Francis. And you will see places like St. Peter's Square filled with people there grieving and marking the death of a man whom they loved. And that space is designed to be able to do that and to be able to hold huge services outdoors of the type that we will see with his funeral, I would imagine. Rome will be a place of grieving for a period of time, and then it will shift, probably quite sharply, 15 days later, into being a place that is now suddenly trying to work out what the future will be. And Rome, again, is a place of intrigue. It's also a place which can hold that reality too. So it's going to be an interesting place to be for the next month.
And Catherine, we mentioned this earlier on about the due process that will now take place. Of course, we mentioned there the mourning that will take place, but of course there is another incredibly historical process that will have to take place, the election process that will decide the new pope. Just give our viewers a sense of exactly what will happen.
So the College of Cardinals will come together and vote, and as you've already said, this is a secretive process, so we won't know other than when the smoke rises, the black smoke to indicate that a decision has not been made, and the white smoke to indicate that a decision has been made and there is a new pope. And until that point, we describe it as sede vacant. The seat is vacant. The seat of Peter is vacant in that space. And there has been a lot of discussion because Pope Francis's death is not unexpected. He's 88 and he'd been unwell for some time. So there has been a lot of discussion around who the next pope will be. And we don't know, but there's a few key names that keep coming up now and again, and we will have to watch this space.
And what do these names represent in terms of the sort of theological, ideological leaning of the Church?
Well, there are some who would be more aligned with Pope Francis' legacy, and some who are not at all, and some who are just taking quite a middle ground which will offer good guidance and not particularly either one side or the other. Some key names are Parolin, who was mentioned by Damien Thompson. So Cardinal Parolin brokered the China deal, which is problematic, but he's a key name coming up. Cardinal Tagle is a popular name, but he was head of Caritas and was about a year ago taken down from that, and we don't know why, so I'm not sure what's going on with him. I'd love to see Cardinal Sarah. Cardinal Sarah is an African pope. He's 79, I think. So
an African cardinal.
Sorry.
You're getting ahead of yourself there.
Well done. African cardinal. I was getting ahead of myself. But I'd love to see him. He's been a really strong and faithful leader speaks and writes very, very well.
Correct me if I'm wrong, there's never been an African
I don't
pope.
think there has, no.
No, that would be a very
Father
interesting...
Marcus, if I'm wrong.
I wonder if there was in the very early days, but I
Perhaps
can't
a
think
Carthaginian
of one
pope or something. I don't know. Yeah, it could, quite possibly. But interestingly enough, there has been one English pope before the break with Rome. Which I suppose to someone that's sort of grown up in England that's very much sort of not of the Catholic bent, it does seem sort of strange to me, but also fascinating.
What, the English Pope?
Yes.
Yes, Adrian the Fourth, if I remember.
Was it Nicholas Breakspear?
It was Nicholas Breakspear.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to round it all up here. We're coming to the top of the hour, but both to Father Marcus Walker and indeed to Catherine Bennett, thanks so much for joining us here on GB News.
Indeed.
The time is now 2 o'clock on Monday, the 21st of April. I'm Tom Harwood.
And I'm Sophie Reaper.
Well, throughout the afternoon, we'll bring you continuing coverage of the death of Pope Francis, who's passed away aged 88. The pontiff had experienced a string of health worries in recent years and spent 38 days in hospital in February this year. But only yesterday, he greeted crowds on Easter Sunday in St. Peter's Square.
Yes, throughout the show today, we will bring you the latest reaction as tributes pour in from around the globe. We'll also have expert analysis, as well as any developments as crowds continue to gather in their thousands outside the Vatican. Over the course of the next few weeks, of course, around 130 cardinal electors will make their way to the Vatican ahead of the highly anticipated papal conclave. But before any of that, we'll get the bulletins with Sophia Wensler.
Tom, Sophie, thank you. Good afternoon. Your headlines at 2 o'clock. In other news, Russian drone attacks have been reported across Ukraine just hours after the end of the 30-hour Easter truce declared by Moscow. Ukraine's Air Force issued air raid alerts for the eastern half of the country, while in the southern city of Mykolaiv, explosions were heard. It was not immediately clear whether there were any casualties. It follows a brief Easter truce declared by Vladimir Putin, which both Ukraine and Russia accused each other of breaching. The UK government has dismissed the ceasefire as a one-day stunt, backing Ukraine's call for a longer pause. Meanwhile, US President Donald Trump has said he hopes Russia and Ukraine will make a deal this week. Pressure is growing for the Prime Minister to break his silence on the Supreme Court's ruling that biological sex defines a woman. Sir Keir Starmer has been accused of refusing to stop a plot by ministers to thwart the landmark gender judgment. Labour MPs are reportedly plotting to circumvent the judgment in leaked WhatsApp messages. It's understood Number 10 has not taken action against those involved, insisting the messages aren't an attempt to undermine the court's decision. It comes after trans rights activists gathered for an emergency demonstration over the weekend, where multiple statues were defaced, including that of feminist hero Millicent Fawcett. Home Secretary Yvette Cooper has slammed the vandalism as disgraceful, but Sir Keir Starmer is yet to comment. Elsewhere, Britain is set to ramp up domestic explosive and weapons manufacturing amid fears President Trump has made the US an unreliable partner. The defence industry will dramatically increase its munitions production, so it no longer needs to rely on the US and France for ammunition. That's according to reports in the Times newspaper. The UK will produce RDX explosives used in British Army guns and other weapons. Meanwhile, the UK defence company BAE Systems is also looking to build 3 new sites to add resilience to the major project. Donald Trump has been told to sack his defence secretary over reports of a second war plans group chat. It's been revealed Pete Hegseth has been linked to another WhatsApp group about sensitive military operations, this time including his wife, brother and personal lawyer. The chat reportedly contained details of an attack on Yemen's Iran-aligned Houthis in March. It comes after military details from a first WhatsApp group were last month revealed by a journalist from The Atlantic, who was accidentally added to the chat. Now, around 49,000 A&E patients were forced to wait 24 hours or more for a hospital bed last year. That's according to NHS figures. Data compiled by the Liberal Democrats from a Freedom of Information request shows the longest wait was 10 days and 13 hours. Figures show trolley waits, meaning the time taken from a patient being transferred to a ward, were 19.8% higher than 2023 and 57.9% higher than 2022. The government has made cutting NHS waiting lists one of its key missions. Easter Monday is expected to be the busiest day of the year so far for travel from abroad to the UK. Traffic congestion is expected across large parts of the country, with the RAC warning that today could be the busiest in 3 years. With schools back tomorrow, over 500,000 people are returning from holidays in Europe and beyond. Travellers on ferries from northern France to Dover may face long border delays, while in the UK, motorway queues and rail disruptions are expected. And Gatwick has been named the UK's worst airport for flight delays for the second year running, according to new data from the Civil Aviation Authority. Flights were on average delayed by more than 24 minutes in 2024. The other airports in the top 5 are Birmingham, Manchester, Stansted and Teesside International Airport. Those are the latest GB News headlines. More in half an hour.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Done. My Claim Group sponsors the GB News Finance Report.
And here's a quick snapshot of today's markets. The pound will buy you $1.3266 and €1.1664. The price of gold is £2,540 and 16 pence per ounce. And the FTSE 100's at 8,275 points.
Done. My Claim Group sponsors the GB News Finance Report.
Good afternoon, Britain. It is 6 minutes past 2. Now, as we've been reporting throughout the show, of course, Pope Francis, the head of the Catholic Church, has died.
Indeed, he was the first pope from both the Western Hemisphere and South America, ascending to the papacy in 2013 as the figurehead of the world's 1.3 billion Catholics. Cameron Walker takes a look back on the life of an extraordinary man.
March 2013, and Jorge Mario Bergoglio stood on the balcony of St. Peter's in Rome and said a simple Buenos Aires.
Fratelli e sorelle, grazie tante dell'accoglienza.
It was the start of a very different pontificate from his predecessor Benedict, who'd retired from his onerous duties. The former Archbishop of Buenos Aires was the first pope to take the name of Francis, the saint of the poor and of nature. He was, though, to usher in a time of richer relations with his worldwide congregation, both in style and substance. And that soon became evident as he made his presence in the Vatican more accessible. Gone were the grand papal apartments, he moved to the Casa Santa Marta to live simply with others. When he visited the headquarters of the EU, he did so in a battered car, and a more informal approach echoed the approach of John Paul II. The carnival is over, he declared, referring to the Vatican's cliques and factions. There was instead a whirling circus of high-profile media appearances.
I think we haven't get to waiting.
The Pope wanted to be part of the modern world. He was clearly spontaneous and open. When asked about homosexuality, he answered, "Who am I to judge?" But did indeed pass judgment publicly on those who had been abused.
Faccio un sentito appello per la lotta a tutto campo contro gli abusi di minori nel campo sessuale come in altri campi, da parte di tutte le autorità e delle singole persone, perché si tratta di crimini abominevoli che vanno cancellati dalla faccia della terra.
This was one of his earliest challenges, how to deal with the spectre of child abuse that had hung over the Catholic Church. His papacy became an opportunity to end decades of evasion and cover-ups. But traditionalists were fearful of his modernizing tendencies, affirming in their view, when he banned the Latin Mass, a form of liturgy popular with conservative Catholics.
Buon pranzo e arrivederci.
He went on to speak one then of Muslims as brothers and was vocal in his support of migrants, even taking in some families to live in the Vatican itself. He also pitted himself against African Orthodox bishops on the issue of homosexuality, where Pope Francis went further than his predecessors. Although he never actually blessed the concept of gay marriage, he appeared to observe the rule of love above the rule of law. In a documentary for the Disney Plus channel, he also reflected that priests should be merciful towards women seeking an abortion. As the world was gripped by the COVID crisis, Francis publicly encouraged all Catholics to get vaccinated. He called this a small gesture of love in poverty, at a time when skepticism was sweeping parts of the globe, but the death toll was rising. Especially across his home continent of South America, he felt the need for practical as well as spiritual leadership. With the invasion of Ukraine, the Vatican needed to deliver its own message in the war of words between Russia and the West.
Questa bandiera viene dalla guerra, proprio da quella città martoriata Bucha.
Pope Francis denounced the wake of death and destruction, describing the war as a crime against God and humanity. He warned of a rising nuclear threat, echoing the views of millions when he said the world once more feels fear and anguish.
Per favore, non dimentichiamo di pregare per la martoriata Ucraina.
But despite this continued spiritual strength, his physical being was weakening. Knee problems left him using a wheelchair for long periods. In the summer of 2021, he underwent abdominal surgery, and then bronchitis hospitalized him in the spring of 2023. It was acknowledgement of his increasing frailty. He felt a malaise, he said, but I wasn't afraid. And he continued with his duties in all humility. He had admitted drafting a letter of resignation in the event of illness, making it impossible for him to continue with his duties as Benedict had done. But then, in a more recent interview, he reflected he had no real intention of taking that step. His ministry, he said, was his life.
Well, delighted to say that Cameron Walker joins us now from outside Westminster Cathedral. Cameron, good to hear you live, as well as in that pre-recorded film you put together for us. What is the mood there at Westminster Cathedral?
Well, sombre, Tom, as you can probably imagine. I have gone inside the cathedral a couple of times over the last few hours, and there have been lots of people in silent prayer. There was a mass held a little bit earlier on today, and Westminster Cathedral, of course, pretty much focal points here in the United Kingdom for the Catholic faith, has released some details as to their plans for the next few days. So a Requiem Mass is going to be held at 5:30 p.m. tonight. That will be held by Cardinal Vincent Nichols, who's the Archbishop of Westminster, and then there will be another mass for a Requiem Mass for the next 3 days, and the cathedral will remain open until midnight for the next 3 days as well. And for the rest of the morning period, each day there will be a Requiem Mass too. Now, we have spoken to a number of people who gathered here to pay their respects to Pope Francis, who passed away at the age of 88 at around 7:35 local time to the Vatican this morning, and this is what they told us.
It was not any pope, it's our pope, it was our pope, and well, I think it's the best for him because he stopped feeling well, or he was very ill, so I think it's the best for him.
And how do you think his legacy will be remembered?
A pope that made lots of changes, and he was very brave, and well, he was a strong man with conviction.
It's certainly a very devastating news. He's the Holy Father, he's the head of the Church Universal, and I think all Catholic faithful in the world must be devastated hearing this news today. I think it might be too early to make a statement about his legacy now, but I'm quite confident his pontificate will be one of the most important pontificates in the modern history of the Church.
He was elected. I was also as a tourist here in London, and I came to this place when we saw that the smoke was white, and we all want to know who is the new Pope. So I'm very moved that today I hear that he's entered immortality.
Well, Pope Francis was last seen just yesterday, around 24 hours ago, for Easter Sunday in St. Peter's Basilica on the balcony, waving to the crowds. He managed to tell them Happy Easter, but an aide read out the blessing on his behalf. He was also in the Pope-mobile, where he waved to the crowds in St. Peter's Square and stopped it a number of times to allow babies to be brought up to him so he could bless them. Perhaps one of the last duties he carried out as Pope before he passed away this morning. World leaders have been paying tribute to the Pope, including the King. He says that King and Queen are most deeply saddened to learn of the death of Pope Francis and were greatly moved to have been able to visit him earlier in the month. Sir Keir Starmer has also paid tribute, saying he was a Pope for the poor, the downtrodden and the forgotten. And President Donald Trump also says, rest in peace, Pope Francis. May God bless him and all who loved him. Now, we are expecting between 10 and 15 days of mourning. His funeral plans, we know already, have been modified and simplified on his request. He only wants to have a simple coffin, simple wood. He doesn't want to be buried in the usual place that popes are buried in St. Peter's Basilica. Instead, he wants to be buried in Rome's St. Mary Major Basilica instead. And then, of course, we've got the conclave, where they will be electing the cardinals a new pope. That is not expected to start to about around 15 days' time, where they lock themselves in the Sistine Chapel and vote on a new pope. But for now, it is about really paying tribute to Pope Francis. And as I said, here at Westminster Cathedral in central London, a special mass will be held at 5:30 p.m. this evening.
OK, well, Cameron Walker, thank you very much indeed joining us there from Westminster Cathedral.
And we are, of course, now seeing pictures of the Vatican. In the distance there, you can see St. Peter's Basilica, where we're seeing people already beginning to gather to pay their respects. We heard some people there outside Westminster Cathedral coming to pay their respects. But, of course, already we've heard from many political figures around the world who've come together to give their thoughts on Pope Francis and to pay their respects. So to tell us more about that now, we're joined in the studio by our political correspondent, Catherine Forster. Catherine, one area in particular we've heard quite a few statements from is the United States. You want to just tell us a bit about that?
Yes, we have. Well, the President, Donald Trump, posted on Truth Social, "Rest in peace, Pope Francis, ! May God bless him and all who loved him, ! We've also heard from the previous US President, Joe Biden, who described Pope Francis as one of the most consequential leaders of our time. Goes on to say he was unlike any who came before him. We also heard a little bit earlier from the US Vice President, J.D. Vance, who, of course, was in Rome only yesterday, actually had a very brief meeting with the Pope, and he said, "My heart goes out to the millions of Christians all over the world who loved him. I was happy to see him yesterday, though he was obviously very ill." He goes on to say, "God rest his soul." Worth noting that J.D. Vance is himself a Catholic. He converted about 6 years ago.
Interesting there that both J.D. Vance and Joe Biden are Catholics at the top of American politics. And I think I'm right in saying that Biden was the first Catholic president since JFK. So a sort of significant Catholic revival in the United States at the moment on both sides of the aisle.
Yes, and of course in South America, huge number of Catholics, and we've heard in the last hour or so from the Brazilian President Lula da Silva. He has said humanity loses today a voice of respect and welcome for others, and he's announced a period of 7 days of mourning in Brazil. Brazil, the largest Catholic population in the whole world, I think over 120 million Catholics in that country. And of course, this Pope was the first Pope from South America. He came from Argentina, of course. And over in Europe, the Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, has said quite simply, "The Pope's death makes me deeply sad. He was a great man and a great shepherd." And our own Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, has said his leadership in a complex and challenging time for the world and the Church was courageous, yet always came from a place of deep humility. Went on to say Pope Francis was a pope for the poor, the downtrodden and the forgotten. He was close to the realities of human fragility, meeting Christians around the world facing war, famine, persecution and poverty, yet he never lost hope of a better world.
Well, Catherine Forster, thank you so much for bringing us that political reaction in the studio this afternoon.
Well, let's get some more reaction now from the political commentator, herself a Catholic, Sarah Elliott. Sarah, thanks for being with us today. This is, of course, a moment for Catholics around the world to take stock and, I suppose, remember the last 12 years of an extraordinary life.
Indeed, and as was just said, he has really been a unique figure as Pope. He really started a lot of new traditions and changed tradition along the way. And from an American perspective, he was loved and also met with a bit of confusion as well. His legacy will be divided in the United States. He was beloved by those who are less fortunate, migrants, refugees, and those who, you know, may not get to experience the better things in life, but those who were very dedicated to the Latin Rite Mass, to tradition and orthodoxy, and anyone seeking clarity on church teaching. Pope Francis did not offer that clarity for them, but he really focused his ministry on compassion and mercy, forgiveness, meeting people where they are. He didn't offer clarity on divorcees in the church or even on the issue of homosexuality. But yet, at the same time, he was a tough prosecutor of sex abuse and pedophilia. So there are definitely things that divide the American Catholic congregation, but there are things that can also be admired of Pope Francis as well. He weighed in a lot on politics, on climate change and economics. He met with the communist Fidel Castro, which to many Americans was unforgivable. So he tried to change the way things went or how to look at a particular topic. So, you know, he will have implemented a great impression on many people over the last 12 years.
Indeed, Sarah, and a lot of people will, of course, agree that something he certainly did do was remain committed to supporting the poor, of course, himself taking his papal name from St. Francis of Assisi. Is that something you'd like to see in his replacement going forward? Someone who's once again committed to supporting, as our own Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer said earlier today, supporting the downtrodden and the needy?
Of course, and that is the purpose of the gospel, to, you know, give to those who are less fortunate, and to think of everyone, and everyone is equal in the eyes of God. No one is more special, or there's no hierarchy with the Heavenly Father. So we must all treat everyone the same. And that is a wonderful legacy he brought to the papacy, and to remind everyone that we are all equal in our dignity. And he spoke out a lot for the voiceless, such as the unborn. He was a strong anti-abortion advocate. He voiced concern for those in the womb and the elderly. He was anti-euthanasia. He talked about giving care and love and support and compassion, and not to judge others harshly or where they're from.
And yet a difficult relationship between himself and perhaps the current administration in the White House. A brief meeting with J.D. Vance yesterday, but of course, during the first Trump era, that presidential election back in 2016, Pope Francis went out of his way to say that building walls is not Christian. Building walls, of course, being one of the primary policy objectives of the Trump administration.
I mean, this is one of the controversies around him. You know, he did weigh in on politics, which didn't make everyone feel very comfortable about. And, you know, then the director of Homeland Security pointed out that Vatican City has a wall around it to protect itself from outsiders. So, you know, he was not one to shy away from voicing an opinion, whether it be popular or not. And he felt he was living out the gospel of Christ and showing love and dignity to all around him.
OK, well, Sarah Elliott, thank you very much for joining us, giving your reflections on the life of Pope Francis, an extraordinary pope and indeed one who's left a mixed legacy for many people.
Absolutely, and if you are watching on television, you'll now be seeing some live pictures from the Vatican there, St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. But joining us now to continue our reflections this afternoon, we're joined in the studio by Church of England clergyman, the Reverend Marcus Walker, as well as co-host of Catholic Unscripted, Catherine Bennett. Just, Catherine, to come to yourself first, just the legacy of Pope Francis, 12 years as the Pope. How will he be remembered?
Well, he was definitely an interesting Pope, an interesting figure. Controversial, I would say. There's been a lot made of the way in which he's been humble and simple and ordinary. And to the extent that he was those things, that's to be celebrated. However, I think, looking from the inside, I think it would be a lie to say that it wasn't a divisive papacy. He lacked clarity quite often, and the problem of that is that for those looking with a more progressive lens, they weren't satisfied because he wasn't progressive enough. And for those who are quite traditional and conservative, they felt that he was, in his pastoral approach, more so than I would say a true change of doctrine, but he wanted to emphasise a pastoral approach, almost at the expense of doctrine, and that didn't satisfy or please those more traditional. So in that sense, I don't know that the image of him as a unifying pope is quite accurate. I would say he's left something of a mess, which is what he had said he said in World Youth Day 2013, make a mess. So I would say that's probably a fair legacy.
Now, of course, he did try to expand the church. He did try to, in some ways, modernise the church. There was a big controversy over the use of Latin in Mass, in services. What exactly was that all about?
Well, Latin is the official language of the church. It's a holy language, and Pope Francis... So the masses in church, the liturgy, would always have been in Latin until very relatively recently. And then during the time of the sort of 1960s, the Second Vatican Council, there was what's called the Novus Ordo, which is the ordinary Mass that you would attend today in the vernacular, which is in the language of the country in which you live. So here it would be in English. And Pope Francis... Pope Benedict before him issued Summorum Pontificum, and in that he said what has always been sacred will always be sacred. In other words, we can have two. We can have the Novus Ordo and the traditional liturgy, and they are both valid and holy and right and beautiful. But Pope Francis issued something called Traditionis Custodes, which suppressed the priest's freedom to celebrate the traditional liturgy, taking it back to the bishops, essentially, so that the bishops had to say, you may or may not. Where what Pope Benedict had said is that it's in the purview of the priest who has the authority to say the Mass. And actually what we've found, what's quite beautiful, really, is that there are what we've seen in the growth of the church is there is growth in the drawing towards this beautiful traditional liturgy. That's where we're really seeing the growth. And in the seminaries, we're seeing growth in the ICKSP and the FSSP.
Oh, those are a lot of acronyms.
I'm so sorry about that. That's what it is it's growth in very traditional wings of the church. I don't like using the term wings because it's one church, but we see priests who are wanting to learn the traditional rite, and it is so beautiful and divine. So there's been a bit of controversy around that.
Reverend Marcus Walker, we'll bring yourself in now. We've spoken earlier in the afternoon about how much time you've spent in Rome and, of course, the Vatican. Just give our viewers a sense of everyone, the many people who will now be heading there to pay their respects. Give us a sense of how it feels to be in the home, essentially, of Catholicism. What is that feeling like?
Well, the whole of Rome really is designed around around the festivals and ceremonies and rites and so on of the Roman Catholic Church, and it's very much focused around that, with the big sweeping avenues, the Via della Conciliazione, the big one that leads up to the Vatican, leading up to St. Peter's Square, being really the main sort of triumphal route, in a way, of the city of Rome. It's designed for occasions like this, where hundreds of thousands of people, maybe millions, are going to be coming to Rome to pay their respects to the Pope, and they're going to be gathering around St. Peter's, which is the great church where the bones of St. Peter lie, down underneath the high altar, the rock upon which the church was built. And people are going to be gathering there to grieve for and remember and pray for the soul of a Pope who was greatly loved across the whole world. And Rome is a city that can absorb that kind of grief, can hold it and allow people the space to grieve. And then it's also a city of intrigue. 15 days later, it's going to pivot to being the place where everybody is now suddenly starting to turn to the future and to think about what's coming next.
It is fascinating to think of the Vatican as this sort of, or at least St. Peter's as this sort of stay through time, as the city of Rome fell, as it sort of was reduced to a shadow of itself, the church remained. As the political power shifted eastwards, it became the fact of the papacy in Rome that was Rome.
Yes, I mean, there's a really interesting little marker of the history that sits in the middle of St. Peter's Square, which is this obelisk, this Egyptian obelisk, which originally sat in a circus, in a hippodrome, which was used both for horse races but also for executions, and it's where St. Peter was executed. And that obelisk, well, it's quite likely that was one of the last things, possibly the last thing, that St. Peter saw as he was being crucified upside down in that hippodrome, and that be moved into the middle of the square. And it's a real marker of the continuity from the pagan empire that killed St. Peter to the centre of the Catholic Church and at times of the Christian world. And that's where hundreds of thousands of people are going to gather over the next few days.
Absolutely remarkable. What history, but also what a moving thing to think about, that what started this all, what started it all was, of course, a very famous crucifixion, but also another crucifixion, and that sort of line of popes that's followed on from that, being able to trace its way all the way 2,000 years is something worth remarking upon, is something worth remembering. Well, Reverend Marcus Walker and indeed Catherine Bennett, thanks indeed for being with us throughout the course of this hour. We're going to catch up with you in just a moment's time, but for now, it's time for the past headlines with Sophia Wensler.
Tom, Sophie, thank you. Your headlines from the GB newsroom. Russian drone attacks have been reported across Ukraine just hours after the end of a 30-hour Easter truce declared by Moscow. Ukraine's Air Force issued air raid alerts for the eastern half of the country, while in the southern city of Mykolaiv, explosions were heard. It was not immediately clear whether there were any casualties. It follows a brief Easter truce declared by Vladimir Putin, which both Ukraine and Russia accused each other of breaching. The UK government has dismissed the ceasefire as a one-day stunt, backing Ukraine's call for a longer pause. Meanwhile, US President Donald Trump has said he hopes Russia and Ukraine will make a deal this week. In other news, pressure is growing for the Prime Minister to break his silence on the Supreme Court's ruling that biological sex defines a woman. Sir Keir Starmer has been accused of refusing to stop a plot by ministers to thwart the landmark gender judgment. Labour MPs are reportedly plotting to circumvent the judgment in leaked WhatsApp messages. It's understood Number 10 has not taken action against those involved, insisting the messages aren't an attempt to undermine the court's decision. It comes after trans rights activists gathered for an emergency demonstration over the weekend, where multiple statues were defaced, including that of feminist hero Millicent Fawcett. Home Secretary Yvette Cooper has slammed the vandalism as disgraceful, but Sir Keir Starmer is yet to comment. Elsewhere, around 49,000 A&E patients were forced to wait 24 hours or more for a hospital bed last year. That's according to NHS figures. Data compiled by the Liberal Democrats from Freedom of Information requests shows the longest wait was 10 days and 13 hours. Figures showed trolley waits, meaning the time taken for a patient to be transferred to a ward, were 19% higher than 2023 and 57% higher than 2022. The government has made cutting NHS waiting lists one of its key missions. Prison officers are calling on the Justice Secretary to allow the use of electric stun guns in UK's most dangerous jails. They'll make the demand when they meet with Shabana Mahmood on Wednesday this week. The meeting comes after Hashem Abidi, one of the men responsible for the Manchester Arena bombing, threw hot oil at officers and stabbed them with makeshift weapons at HMP Frankland in County Durham. The prison service said it will investigate whether frontline staff should be given protective body armour following the attack, while the Ministry of Justice has pledged to carry out a review. And Gatwick has been named the UK's worst airport for flight delays for the second year running. That's according to new data from the Civil Aviation Authority. Flights were on average delayed by more than 24 minutes in 2024. The other airports in the top 5 are Birmingham, Manchester, Stansted and Teesside International Airport. Those are the latest GB News headlines. More in half an hour.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
My Claim Group sponsors the GB News Finance Report.
And here's a quick snapshot of today's markets. The pound will buy you $1.3266 and €1.1664. The price of gold is £2,552 and 4 pence per ounce. And the FTSE 100's at 8,275 points.
My Claim Group sponsors the GB News Finance Report.
Well, good afternoon, Britain. It's 36 minutes past 2. Thank you indeed for joining us for our continuing coverage of the death of Pope Francis. We're looking at live pictures here from the Vatican, from St. Peter's Square, looking on at St. Peter's Basilica there in all of its majesty. But of course, we've been getting reaction from across the United Kingdom as well. And nowhere has the Catholic faith been perhaps more vivid in the public imagination than just across the Irish Sea over there on the island of Ireland, but also particularly in Northern Ireland, where our reporter Doogie Beattie is there for us. Doogie, in times gone by, this would have been a very controversial sort of moment in Northern Ireland, but perhaps greater political unity today.
Well, very much so, Tom. I'm at Armagh, the home of the Catholic Church in Ireland. And really, this Pope was something different. Not only was he the first Jesuit Pope, he was also the first Pope from the Southern Hemisphere. But one of his closest friends was a guy called Louis Paul, who was an evangelistic Presbyterian preacher in and around Buenos Aires. And this Pope really tried to preach evangelism and taking Christianity to those who really needed it. And the problem in Britain, of course, right across the British Isles, is we haven't seen real poverty, not the sort of poverty that is in South America and Buenos Aires, where you're looking at slums. We see social poverty, which is something totally different. And he has grown the Catholic Church. He, in fact, has grown Christianity because of his very basic evangelistic message that comes around him. I'm only back from the United States last night, and we were speaking to Calvinists Calvinist ministers there about the birth of America, and they were even saying that this particular Pope, his message has started to bring people back to the pews inside their churches. So it is really being felt across the world, but here in Ireland, it's quite a healing thing, actually. People from all sides of the community, even Edwin Poots, the Speaker of the House in Stormont, has just put out a letter of condolence on how he is very sad about this Pope's passing. So it just shows you the type of ministry that this Pope really had. And earlier on, I caught up with the Archbishop of Ireland, Eamon Martin.
We're filled with a combination of sadness, of course, but also immense gratitude because we say farewell now to a very faithful shepherd who has very much walked closely with us all through our joys and sorrows over this past 12 years. I think his papacy, Pope Francis's papacy, has been a profound gift to the Church and indeed to the world. And so on behalf of Archbishop Dermot and the Irish bishops and all of the Catholic faithful on the island of Ireland, I extend sympathy to his family members, to everybody who has worked closely with him in his role, and everyone around the globe who will mourn his loss. I think there was something different about this Pope who came to us from the ends of the earth 12 years ago. On that very first night, whenever he stood on the balcony of St. Peter's Square, he wished everybody Buona Sera, and it took everybody by surprise. It was such a simple, personable greeting. And I was just thinking this morning that his final greeting to people was Buona Pasqua, Happy Easter.
Well, you can hear from that message it is looking forward, basically also mourning the past. But it's quite interesting that I'm trying to work out how many cardinals will now actually have a right to vote in the new papal elections. And I think there's only one, the Cardinal of Westminster, because of course with canon law, after you're 80 years of age, a cardinal cannot vote in that election. And Pope John VI, I think it was, made sure that that wouldn't happen. So the British Isles will be only one representative in this new election for this particular Pope. So with that, it is back to you.
Well, Dougie Beattie, thanks indeed for joining us there live from County Armagh. Well, we're looking still at live pictures from Vatican City, but delighted to be joined by the author and journalist Kevin Marr. Kevin, this is a moment for people all around the world to be reflecting.
It is. I mean, Pope Francis was a very different kind of Pope than we've been perhaps used to. You know, he was the people's Pope, if I can put it like that. He was from a very humble origins himself. He's the first Latin American Pope. He's the first Pope, I think, that's really had a real connection to being a pastor of a flock and really being used to operating in, as Dougie was saying a few minutes ago, in the favelas of Buenos Aires when he was Archbishop there, catching the buzz by himself. The first thing he did when he became Pope in 2013 was to phone his newsagent up and cancel his newspapers. You know, he was a very ordinary, in a very extraordinary way, in that the trappings of the office of Pope had no interest for him. You know, he lived a very simple life. He didn't live in the papal apartments. He made a point of living in a house with other priests. You know, he dressed, you know, rather shabbily for a Pope. And he did that deliberately to make a point that he chose the name Francis upon becoming Pope, the very first Pope Francis of the 266 popes that we've had in direct line since St. Peter. And he chose Francis because St. Francis of Assisi is patron saint of the poor, as well as animals and ecology, but patron saint of the poor. And he famously said that a dictum attributed to St. Francis is, go out there and preach the gospel and use words if you must. And you know what that means is through your actions, through your deeds, people will be inspired and take leadership from you. And that's, I think, precisely what Pope Francis has done for the last 10 years. He's been an extraordinary voice for the marginalised around the world. He's cast a light on all kinds of issues, everything from the environment and ecology, as the name Francis would suggest, right the way through to migrant rights, which often puts him in the crosshairs of politicians. And this is of course the role of the Pope. The Pope is not there to lead a political party or to lead a government or to lead a country. The Pope is there to be a global figure of inspiration and influence, and remaining true to the teachings, the historical teachings of the Catholic faith, which is what he does. And 1.4 billion people around the world are Catholic at the moment. It's one of the fastest growing religions in the world, even though we may be struggling a little bit in the West these days. In other parts of the world, the Catholic Church is absolutely booming, and a lot of it is down to the direct leadership of Pope Francis, as Dougie was saying a few minutes ago, and his summation of it.
No, absolutely fascinating, particularly that sort of what some would view as political, what some would view as humanitarian. I think there's always going to be that sort of tension there. But Kevin Marr, author and journalist, thank you indeed for joining us there.
Well, we can now get some more reaction from around the UK, of course, as we have been doing all afternoon. So we can speak to our GB News Yorkshire and Humber reporter, Anna Riley, who is live in Leeds for us. Anna, what's the mood like in Leeds there outside the cathedral?
Well, Sophie, yes, we're here at Leeds Cathedral and it's been a sombre mood, but speaking to people after the Easter Monday Mass here, people have also, as well as paying tribute to Pope Francis and the Pope that he was and the legacy that he left, also saying that he's gone to heaven, he's gone to a better place, so that's what reassures Catholics here. We also spoke to the Bishop of Leeds, Marcus Stock, and this is the message that he had for us.
It was a real shock to hear of his death this morning. I gather he died about 7:35. I was actually celebrating Mass at 6:35, so at the time he died in my private chapel. So it was a great sadness that we've all learned of this news. But we are offering this Mass for the Pope's soul, and we'll be saying some prayers for his soul at the end of the Mass itself. I'd say that the Holy Father will be delighted that he died on Easter, at Easter time, because throughout his pontificate he's talked about the mercy of God, he's talked about the hope of God, and particularly hope for people who feel on the edge of society, people on the peripheries, as he put it. And I think he will recognise the beauty of actually dying at a time of great hope. And I think his life and his death will give hope to others.
The Bishop of Leeds there speaking about the legacy of the Pope and also the poignancy in which they passed away this Easter weekend as well. And that's a message that other Catholics here have been telling me. There's been the Easter Mass in which candles have also been lit for Pope Francis. There was a picture of him at the front of the church in which people could go and pay their respects and pray for him as well. So a real sombre mood here, but also people reflecting, including people who met the Pope themselves as well and told me that it was the best moment of their lives. So just reflecting on his legacy and now the Church coming together, obviously millions of Catholics grieving around the world. A lot of focus has been in London, Westminster, but also cathedrals and Catholic churches up and down the country like this one here in Leeds, people coming for a moment of reflection, a moment of prayer to remember the late Pope Francis.
OK, well, Anna Riley, thank you very much indeed for bringing us that live from Leeds.
Absolutely, and I think we can now go back to some live pictures of the Vatican where, of course, thousands of people have already begun to gather to pay their respects on Easter Monday. Now, we're delighted to be joined once again by our panel Church of England clergyman, the Reverend Marcus Walker, as well as co-host of Catholic Unscripted, Catherine Bennett. Now, Reverend Marcus Walker, I'd like to ask you first, of course, we've been hearing there from Anna and Dougie, our two reporters, about the symbolism of the passing of Pope Francis just the day after Easter Sunday. We also heard from the Archbishop of Ireland, Eamon Martin, who talked about the final message of Pope Francis now being a happy Easter. Just for any of our viewers who are just joining us, talk to us about the poignancy of the facts that he has died on such an important event in the calendar for Catholicism.
Yes, and for all Christians. We have just been walking the way of the cross over the last week on Holy Week, as we've walked with Christ through his final week and gathered on Good Friday and remembered the cross and his crucifixion and his terrible and agonising death. And then on Holy Saturday, the churches have lain empty and dark and abandoned, and we've essentially gone into the psychological space and ritual space of the abandonment of the fear of the death of God. And then, on Easter Day, Christ rose. And we proclaim Christ is risen, and not just that Jesus Christ is risen, but also that because of that, we have the hope of the resurrection. And I think that there is nothing that Pope Francis could have wanted more than to die in the midst of that hope. Or rather, perhaps nobody necessarily wants to die. I mean, I'm not sure if that's quite the right way to put it, but that there is no better time for him to have died, having walked that way of the cross for the last time and seen the resurrection one more time and celebrated the rising of Christ. It's symbolically beautiful.
Yeah. And you really get a sense of duty there too. The fact that he held meetings until the last, that he saw those, that he went and uttered those words in the square that we're looking at now, telling everyone assembled, happy Easter one last time. Catherine Bennett, I want to slightly change the tune because we're hearing a lot about the sort of funeral that Pope Francis will receive. The fact that this might be a bit more of a stripped-down funeral than we've seen before. It may be, well, we know that one of his wishes was to have a more simple one coffin rather than the more traditional 3-coffin structure. But those 3 coffins do hold a lot of symbolism within the Catholic Church.
Yes, they do, Tom. We have to begin by saying what is the Pope, because he's been described in some of your interviews as a global figure of inspiration. And in fact, that is not primarily the role of the Pope. It is to guard the tradition, the deposit of faith in perpetuity until the second coming. That is the role of the Pope. And there is a lot of... We spoke about the Pope talking about poverty. And in fact, what we see is real spiritual poverty. And so people are getting fed up with the messages of the world, with the empty messages of the world, and they're coming into the church where they see truth. And you spoke about the simplicity there. Again, unfortunately, as we talk about Pope Francis's choice for simplicity, whether it's his papal choice not to live in the papal palace or the robes he wears, because we look with this worldly perspective and say, isn't that lovely, we sometimes miss the deeper symbolism. So the 3 coffins that a pope would ordinarily be buried in have significance. So the cypress represents humility in the first coffin. The inner coffin is lead to represent authority. And then the outer coffin is made of elm, which represents dignity. So it's not as if... What I think is a shame is if it's presented as simplicity versus ostentation that is for no reason. There's always a reason, and those things are symbolic. So there is. It's not quite as simple as we're being told about the choices he's always made.
Of course, another, perhaps you could describe it as unique choice that he's made, is that he's not going to be buried within the Vatican. He instead will be buried at St Mary's Major. Why do you think he made that particular choice?
Well, I know Marcus can speak to this more than I can, but obviously he had an affinity there. I don't know why Pope Francis made the choices he did on a personal level. He has a particular devotion, and that seems to have come into play. But Tom spent quite some time talking about this remarkable institutional organism that's withstood as an anchor in the world for 2,000 years and more. And I think, as Chesterton said, something like, we want a church that will move the world and will not be moved by the world. And so I think that's what people look to the church for, is that steadfast truth and that anchor. Pope Francis' individual decisions, I'm not sure outside of his particular choice and devotion.
Well, Father Marcus, you spent 4 years in Rome under the papacy of Pope Francis. You met him on a number of occasions. You saw him pray at this particular basilica where he has chosen to be buried.
Yes, that's right. He loved Santa Maria Maggiore. It's one of the 4 big churches, one of the 4 papal basilicas in Rome, and it's one of the oldest. It goes back to the 5th century. It has wonderful 5th century mosaics in it, but it also has an icon, a particular icon of the Blessed Virgin Mary, which he had a particular devotion to. And he would go there before every trip abroad and go there on his way back from every trip abroad, and he would spend hours in prayer in that church, which also has a great connection with the Latin American world. For better or worse, it's where the very first gold to be mined in Latin America was brought over, was gifted to the Vatican, was put into the ceiling of that church. So it's got a connection with Latin America.
And just finally, we only have 30 seconds or so, but your impressions of him as a man?
He had a great sense of humour. He loved to tell jokes, and he loved to tell jokes about himself. And he would deflect, quite often, away from sort of the awkwardness of the situation using humour.
Well, Father Marcus Walker and indeed Catherine Bennett, thanks indeed for joining us. And thank you at home for watching along or indeed listening along to our rolling coverage following the death of Pope Francis this Easter Monday at the age of 88. We're remembering the life and indeed the papacy of a man who certainly moved things. He certainly raised questions, and Martin Daubney will be taking the baton on from here. Do not move a muscle. It is, of course, his programme next.
Even though we'll see a cloudy start, it'll be a bright outlook for the rest of the day. Boxed Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Good afternoon and welcome to your latest GB News weather from the Met Office. So it's been a mixed picture over the bank holiday weekend, and that's going to continue as we head through much of next week. Some drier interludes are possible, but we will also see some showers and longer spells of rain. We've got low pressure across us at the moment. A weather front brought some rain last night and into this morning, and that will continue to push its way north and eastwards as we head through the rest of Monday evening. Plenty of showers following on behind, particularly across Northern Ireland and parts of Northern England, though those gradually starting to ease as we head overnight Monday and into the start of Tuesday, where we do see those clear spells likely to turn quite chilly, perhaps a touch of rural frost in places, but generally just staying that little bit milder, particularly across the northeast of Scotland, where we do hold on to that cloud and